Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we slip quietly into the world of marble arches and torchlit corridors, where history remembers one of Rome's most infamous rulers, Caligula. The air is warm, heavy with the scent of olive oil lamps and the faint tang of incense drifting from temple steps. Your sandals scuff along a street where the shadows stretch long, and every echo of laughter feels as though it hides a secret. You probably won't survive this journey through his Rome, not because swords or wild beasts await you in the arena, but because of the suffocating strangeness of a court where the ordinary rules of decency dissolve. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere far away, go ahead and post your location and your local time in the comments. It's always a joy to see where our little midnight family gathers from across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The streets of Rome hum with life, though not the kind of gentle life you'd expect on a warm summer evening. It is a restless hum, a city stretched taut with rumours. You feel it in the marketplace, where a fishmonger mutters about the emperor's latest proclamation. You hear it by the fountains, where children giggle not with innocence but with stories passed down from older siblings who claim to have glimpsed scandal in the palace. Every whisper leads back to Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the man history branded with the affectionate nickname Caligula, meaning little boot. A name that began in boyish charm, worn from the miniature soldier's boots he trotted in as a mascot of the army, but one that would later cloak terrors no legion could contain. You move through the Forum, the great marble heart of the empire, and the statues seem to lean closer as if straining to listen. Senators pass with tight lips, their togas folded stiff, their eyes darting nervously to every corner. For in Caligula's Rome, the difference between survival and disgrace could hinge on whether you laughed at the wrong moment during one of his performances, and make no mistake, the city has become a stage. The emperor is both actor and director, an unpredictable playwright who recasts gods, sisters and citizens alike in his dramas of power. The first impression you catch of this man is not his body, slender, pale, prone to sudden illness, but his presence. Even now, centuries later, you sense how he distorted reality around him. When he declared himself a living god, temples did not crumble in protest. They adapted, adding his name beside Jupiter's. When he commanded silence during his nightly feasts, an entire room of aristocrats obeyed, even if their throats ached to cough. Imagine trying to hold back a sneeze while the most dangerous man in the world studies your expression. That is Rome tonight, a city choking on its own restraint. Historians still argue whether Caligula's reign was a descent into madness or a masterclass in theatrical control. Some say his cruelty was born from a brain fever, others claim it was political calculation disguised as chaos. As you wander deeper, past the colonnades where guards lounge with spears, you realise the debate hardly matters to the people who lived it. For them, the emperor's whims were as real as the stones beneath their feet. When he ordered a senator's wife to be escorted to his chamber during dinner, resistance was unthinkable. When he staged rituals in which the lines between sacred and profane blurred, participation was survival. You pause outside the Palatine Hill, where his palace looms like a mountain of marble and bronze. Torches flare along the gates, illuminating guards with expressions carved from granite. You might expect an emperor's home to be simply grand, but Caligula's is theatrical. Balconies jut out not for air but for spectacle, so he can appear suddenly to the crowds, basking in adoration or silence. Even the fountains here seem to gurgle more nervously, aware that their patterns might be scrutinized for omens. Step inside and you notice something unsettling. The palace feels alive. Tapestries ripple not from wind but from the shuffle of slaves moving unseen. The walls glitter with mosaics of sea gods, their eyes bright as if amused by the games played beneath. You smell roasted meats wafting from kitchens that never truly rest, because the emperor might demand a banquet at any hour, day or night. And above it all, you feel the constant pressure of performance. Courtiers laugh a little too quickly at jokes, musicians pluck strings with trembling fingers, dancers twirl as though their very lives balance on each pirouette. Yet amid the luxury, you notice something raw. Caligula's Rome is not the polished grandeur of Augustus, nor the stern authority of Tiberius. It is louder, stranger, infused with a reckless energy. One evening, He might order ships built on the artificial lake at Baiae, complete with marble floors and orchards on deck. Another, he might dress as Apollo and insist the Senate praise his beauty. The line between political act and private indulgence collapses, leaving the city unsure whether it lives in history or in theatre. Quirky stories cling to him like perfume. Some Romans whisper that he had a favourite horse, Incitatus, whom he pampered with ivory troughs and jewelled harnesses. One fringe account even claims he planned to make the horse a consul, a joke or an insult aimed at the Senate. Whether true or not, the tale captures the mood. An emperor so secure in power that the boundary between satire and governance dissolved. Imagine your boss replacing the boardroom with a petting zoo, and you'll glimpse the absurd dread that hung over Roman politics. But beneath the humour, the city quivers. For every jest there is punishment. When Caligula mocked senators by inviting them to feasts and then auctioning their possessions while they sat helplessly, the laughter froze in throats. When he paraded noblewomen in spectacles that blurred devotion and degradation, their husbands could do nothing but smile. This is the world you now walk into, a Rome where everyone pretends, where truth itself is held hostage to an emperor's performance. A mainstream fact anchors you here. Caligula ruled for only 4 years, from AD 37 to 41. Yet his shadow stretches far beyond that short span, as though intensity outweighs duration. Compare him with emperors who reigned decades and still occupy fewer pages in the collective memory. What he lacked in longevity, he made up in audacity. Every act was magnified by shock, every decree echoed in rumour. You hear the stones of the Forum still murmur his name as you pass, centuries after the torchlight dimmed. As night deepens, you find yourself drifting into one of his banquets. Picture the hall, couches draped in silk, tables sagging under roasted boar and bowls of figs, goblets spilling with Falernian wine. Candles flicker in golden stands, casting light on faces that strain to appear delighted. You slip onto a cushion, unnoticed, and watch. Servants dart silently, refilling cups before they empty, wiping hands before crumbs fall. At the centre reclines Caligula, his eyes gleaming with restless curiosity. He toys with his food the way a cat toys with prey, savouring not the meal, but the tension. Here is where the city learns new definitions of ritual. A toast might turn into a command, a casual remark might seal a senator's fate. Sometimes the emperor drifts into stories, recounting visions of gods who speak only to him. Other times, he performs acts meant to startle, to bend the evening into shapes no one dares question. You sense that these feasts are not about indulgence alone, but about power staged as intimacy. To eat with him is to submit to his theatre, to agree that the rules of the world are whatever he declares. You lean back, the wine heavy on your tongue, and wonder, is this madness or method? Historians still argue whether his displays were symptoms of illness or weapons of dominance. Did he believe himself a god, or did he play the part to remind others they were mere mortals? The question drifts unanswered, like incense smoke vanishing into the rafters. Outside, the streets grow quieter, shops shutter, lamps dim, and Rome tries to sleep. But you, restless traveller, cannot, because you know that behind these palace walls the city's fate twists under the whims of a man who turns every ritual into theatre. You wonder what tomorrow will bring. Another feast, another proclamation, another story whispered by citizens who dare not speak too loudly. As you step back into the night air, the city feels different. The stones beneath your feet seem less solid, the sky above less certain. For once you have glimpsed Caligula's Rome, you understand that reality itself has become unstable, bent to the will of an emperor who treats life as performance. You walk on, past fountains and temples, and the shadows of gods carved in marble seem to wink knowingly. They too, perhaps, were conscripted into his theatre. And so you drift forward, into the next chapter of his world, toward the childhood shadows that shaped him, toward the strange rituals that await. The night stretches long, and you are only at the beginning. You carry on through the streets of Rome, the air still buzzing faintly with that nervous energy. To understand why the man at the centre of this story behaves as he does, you need to step backward, into his youth, into the shadowed corridors of palaces where whispers followed him like loyal pets. The boy who would become Caligula, Gaius, Julius Caesar Germanicus, did not simply grow up. He was moulded by trauma, spectacle, and a family name both adored and cursed. Imagine him small, dressed in miniature soldier's boots, the caligae that gave him the nickname Caligula. At first it was endearing. Soldiers loved to see the child scampering among them, a living mascot of their beloved general Germanicus. You picture the campfires, the clang of armour, the cheer that rose whenever the boy appeared. He was Rome's little promise, a boy born into power, yet wrapped in the laughter of hardened legionaries. And yet, you also feel the sharp edge of irony. That nickname of affection would cling to him even when it no longer fit, as though history insisted on reminding everyone that beneath the emperor's crown lurked a child moulded by forces too great for him to master. But then the shadows deepened. His father, Germanicus, adored by troops and citizens alike, died under suspicious circumstances when Caligula was just a boy. Rumours of poisoning spread, whispers that the reigning emperor, Tiberius, had orchestrated the death to snuff out a rival star. To you, standing in this dim palace hallway, the air itself feels thick with suspicion. Every conversation sounds cautious, every smile tight. The child must have absorbed it all. The way grief turned into gossip, the way loyalty soured into paranoia. Imagine being small enough to still clutch toys, yet old enough to understand that someone powerful may have murdered your father. Mainstream history confirms this. Germanicus's death in AD 19 shocked Rome. He was only 34, and his passing left the empire's people in mourning. The boy Caligula, meanwhile, learned early that adoration can transform swiftly into danger, and that power is never secure. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, strong-willed and fiercely protective, did not stay silent. She accused Tiberius's allies, raised her voice in defiance, and as a result the family bore the emperor's wrath. Exiles, imprisonments, and deaths began to mark Caligula's siblings one by one. You can almost hear the boy's footsteps echoing through prison corridors when he visited family, or see his eyes wide as soldiers escorted relatives away. The empire that once adored his family seemed now to consume them piece by piece. Quirky accounts cling to this period as well. Some claim Agrippina kept her children in strict discipline, forcing them into a regime of severity so they would remain uncorrupted by courtly decadence. Whether true or not, the image lingers. A mother clutching her brood tightly, determined they would survive the same machinery that killed their father. And yet, one by one, those siblings faded into exile or death. The boy remained, walking carefully in a world where loyalty to family meant possible doom. Historians still argue whether these early years seeded Caligula's later cruelty. Did witnessing the destruction of his mother and brothers teach him to wield power ruthlessly before it was wielded against him? Or did the boy's mind fracture under the weight of grief, paranoia, and survival? You wander the silent courtyards of Capri, where later he would live under Tiberius's eye, and you sense how easily a child could learn to smile while hiding terror. Capri, an island of breathtaking cliffs and azure waters. To the traveller it might seem paradise, but to young Caligula it was a gilded cage. Tiberius, retreating from Rome, brought him there, perhaps as a hostage, perhaps as an heir groomed in his own twisted mould. Imagine walking barefoot across marble floors, the sea roaring below while the emperor's old eyes studied your every movement. Was he protector or predator, mentor or executioner? No one could be sure, least of all the boy who had to play along. The island held its own notorious rumours. Ancient gossip painted Tiberius's villa as a place of indulgence and cruelty, where exiled nobles disappeared and grotesque entertainments unfolded by torchlight. Whether exaggerated or not, you feel the weight of it. A child raised in such a place would learn quickly that life itself could be treated as theatre, and that survival meant becoming a performer. Caligula smiled, obeyed, and played the role of loyal ward. Inside, though, you wonder what shadows hardened within him. A mainstream fact, Caligula survived longer than his siblings by being careful. He learned silence, learned to watch and not be watched, to blend in when needed. Roman historian Suetonius later described him as a master of dissimulation in youth, a boy who kept his face smooth and agreeable while chaos swirled around him. Imagine the emotional muscles that takes, holding your breath through every storm, nodding at the very man you might suspect killed your father. But behind the facade you sense the hunger growing, To live so long in the shadow of someone else's power is to crave your own stage one day. You picture Caligula at night, staring out across the sea from Capri, hearing the waves hammer the cliffs, and imagining a Rome where he was no longer the boy in little boots but the man in control. The quirky tidbit of his youth comes alive here. Soldiers adored him even as a child. His presence in the camps during Germanicus's campaigns left an impression. Veterans who later saw him rise to power recalled the boy they had once cheered for. It is almost comical to think. One of Rome's darkest emperors began as its most beloved mascot, wrapped in miniature armour, wobbling proudly among hardened men. Life rarely writes with straight lines, and this twist of irony feels almost scripted. You pause in a quiet hallway, the marble cool beneath your hand, the palace whispers around you, and you imagine what it felt like to be the last survivor. Sisters exiled, brothers dead, mother destroyed, yet you endure. The burden of such survival is heavy, for it demands you find meaning in it. Perhaps this is where the seeds of divine pretension sprouted. If God spared him while others perished, maybe he was chosen. Maybe his survival was proof not of luck, but of destiny. And so you see how easily a man might begin to believe himself more than mortal. Historians still debate whether Caligula's childhood trauma directly caused his later behaviour, or whether writers exaggerated the connection to craft a cautionary tale. Was he truly warped by grief, or simply ambitious from the start? The truth, like a flickering lamp, remains hard to pin down. Yet as you walk these halls, it feels certain that the boy's eyes saw too much, too young, and that the shadows he carried would later spill into the light of Rome. The night around you deepens. You feel the sea breeze drifting from Capri, cool yet suffocating, and you imagine the boy dreaming of freedom. When Tiberius finally died in AD 37, and Caligula ascended to the throne, the city roared with joy. Citizens showered him with devotion, eager for relief from Tiberius's grim reign. But what they embraced was not just a young man. It was the shadowed child of grief and theatre, stepping finally onto his own stage. And so, as you trace the faint echo of his footsteps through marble halls, you realise Caligula's Rome cannot be understood without first walking through these shadows. His childhood was less a chapter than a furnace, shaping every strange ritual, every unsettling indulgence to come. You feel the boy still, hiding inside the man, the little boot that never truly fit, yet left prints across an empire. You drift further into the narrative, feeling Rome shift beneath your feet as the boy in the little soldier's boots takes on a crown of absolute authority. The shadows of Capri and the suffocating watch of Tiberius recede, and suddenly the stage is his. Caligula steps into power in the year 37, and at first the city greets him as though dawn has finally broken after a long night. You hear cheers rolling through the forum, senators lining up with polished smiles, citizens spilling into streets with offerings, and soldiers stamping their feet like a chorus of thunder. Rome, weary of Tiberius's grim and suspicious reign, opens its arms to this young heir. You sense the early days almost glow. When Caligula first assumes the purple, he announces amnesties, recalls exiles, and pays homage to the memory of his father Germanicus. Imagine being one of those citizens who had spent years under Tiberius's suspicious rule, suddenly breathing easier as Caligula tears up lists of enemies, reopens doors of families once shut away. In that first year, it feels as though Rome itself has been reborn. Temples see new offerings, statues of his late mother and brothers are restored, and the people whisper with delight that at last the son of Germanicus rules. But as you know by now, this story is no simple arc of triumph. You walk along marble colonnades, and already the air seems heavier. Because for Caligula, the throne is not just a seat of governance, it is a stage, a platform for performance, and Rome itself the unwilling audience. Imagine the Senate chamber. Senators in their white togas file in, scrolls in hand, prepared for the serious work of empire. But instead of routine debates, they are greeted by a young emperor who strides in not with solemn gravity, but with the sparkle of an actor ready to improvise. He listens for a moment, then interrupts, perhaps with a joke, perhaps with a command to rearrange proceedings on a whim. One day he is gracious, another he scolds them like unruly pupils, another he turns the entire chamber into an audience for his proclamations of divinity. You feel the senator's unease. Are they politicians, or props in his performance? A mainstream fact anchors you. Caligula did indeed emphasize his connection to the gods. He adopted grand titles, erected statues of himself in sacred places, and blurred lines between emperor and deity more boldly than predecessors. Augustus had been revered, Tiberius cautious, but Caligula. He stepped into the theatre of divinity with no hesitation. You picture him entering the temple of Castor and Pollux, not to worship, but to stride across its sacred floor and use it as his personal platform. For him, holy ground was simply another stage. Now, imagine a banquet hall again. Gold gleams on the walls, musicians hover nervously with their lyres, and noble guests recline with shallow breaths. The emperor does not eat quietly. Instead, he might rise and declaim lines as though from a tragedy, or mock his guests or order sudden rearrangements. If the evening grows too dull, perhaps he commands an unexpected ritual to stir the mood. To dine with him is to risk becoming part of the play. You glance around, and every pair of eyes avoids meeting his, as though by lowering their gaze they might avoid being chosen. You begin to notice how this stage extends to every corner of Rome. Games in the circus are not simply entertainment, they are showcases for the emperor's mood. When Caligula appears before the crowds, he expects not just cheers but adoration. A quirky tidbit drifts to your ears. He was said to enjoy watching the faces of the audience more than the gladiatorial fights themselves. Imagine him leaning forward, eyes gleaming, not at the clash of swords but at the shifting expressions of fear, awe, or delight in the stands. For him, the crowd itself was part of the spectacle. Historians still argue whether Caligula's reign can be understood as insanity or calculated theatre. Some suggest his strange behaviours, appearing in costumes of gods, demanding worship or staging bizarre rituals, were deliberate tools to reinforce his control. Others insist he had lost his grip on reality, drifting into delusion. As you stand in the middle of a torchlit atrium, you realise the effect on his subjects was the same. Uncertainty, dread, and the sense that every day might bring a new performance they could not escape. The palace itself seems to transform into a theatre. Corridors are lined not only with statues but with mirrors, reflecting light and multiplying the emperor's presence. Servants move silently, knowing that any mistake might be turned into a scene of humiliation. Courtiers practice their expressions, rehearsing laughter, rehearsing awe, rehearsing grief, whatever role might be demanded. The stagecraft of power here is relentless, and everyone has a part whether they like it or not. You step into the gardens where moonlight filters through cypress trees, and you catch the murmur of another performance. The emperor strolls, perhaps with companions, and suddenly launches into mythological recitation, casting himself as a new Apollo or Dionysus. A companion hesitates, unsure whether to applaud or remain reverent. You sense the tension. What if the wrong reaction brands you as disrespectful? In this theatre, the audience is trapped, unable to leave, forced to cheer even if they do not understand the script. A mainstream fact here. Caligula invested heavily in public works during his reign, from aqueducts to temples. Yet even these projects were not simply civic improvements. They were stages on which he displayed himself. The aqueduct arches that rose across the landscape were not just engineering marvels. They were backdrops to his glory, extensions of his performance into stone. The quirky fringe detail surfaces. Some ancient sources claim Caligula once commanded his troops to march to the shore of the Channel, preparing to invade Britain, only to order them to collect seashells instead, declaring them spoils of the sea. Whether this was madness or mockery of the legions is debated, but it fits the pattern. The emperor treating even military campaigns as absurd theatre, soldiers as unwilling actors in his spectacle. Picture the legionaries, disciplined and armoured, suddenly crouching along the shoreline to scoop shells into helmets, their faces burning with confusion, but unable to question the command. Rome's army, usually the epitome of order, reduced to a bizarre scene of farce. Historians still debate whether this story is exaggerated satire or genuine command. Perhaps Caligula meant it as mockery of the Senate, or perhaps he truly drifted into bizarre whims. Either way, the moment illustrates how the emperor turned every sphere, political, religious, military, into performance art. You notice how the city itself has grown weary. Citizens still cheer when he appears, but the cheers feel strained, practiced. Senators still bow, but their eyes dart nervously. Even the marble seems tired, as though etched with too many hurried inscriptions of divine titles, erased and rewritten with each new proclamation. Yet you, wandering among these courtyards, sense something else, exhilaration. To live in Caligula's Rome is to feel the pulse of unpredictability, the constant drama. It is exhausting, yes, but also unforgettable. The empire feels alive in a dangerous, fevered way, as though the gods themselves had descended into human form and begun improvising without a script. As you leave the palace stage behind, heading toward the darker feasts and rituals waiting ahead, you realise that the emperor himself is never just a man. He's an actor, a god, a child in little boots, a tyrant, and above all a performer who has forced the entire empire into the audience seats. The curtain has risen, and Rome has no choice but to watch. You follow the echo of footsteps deeper into the palace, where marble columns open into vast halls drenched in candlelight. The smell of roasted meats and honeyed wine curls through the air, and the faint plucking of lyres greets your ears like a lullaby played in too high tension. You're entering Caligula's banquets now, not ordinary feasts, but spectacles where food, desire, and power blur into one seamless performance. These halls are less dining rooms and more stages upon which the emperor rehearses his favourite play. Absolute control, dressed in silk and draped with indulgence. You glance around. Low couches circle massive tables carved from rare woods, their surfaces sagging under platters of exotic delicacies. There are eels from the Tiber, dates from Judea, figs swollen with sweetness, pheasants roasted until their skin crackles, and wines poured so freely that the marble floors often turn sticky with spills. But food, you notice quickly, is not the point. The real nourishment comes from watching who will obey, who will falter, who will be humiliated, and who will bask in fleeting favour. A mainstream fact anchors the scene. Roman banquets were indeed central to elite life. They weren't just meals, but rituals of hierarchy, social currency traded through the sharing of delicacies, and stages where patronage was granted or denied. In Caligula's Rome, however, that tradition spiralled beyond precedent. These were not simply feasts, but choreographed dramas, carefully arranged to blur the line between hospitality and humiliation. Picture yourself reclining on one of those couches, trying to appear relaxed while keeping your eyes lowered. Caligula leans at the centre, the hub of the wheel, his pale face alive with restless energy. One moment he bursts into laughter, another he falls silent, letting the air congeal into awkward quiet. Servants hover, terrified of spilling a drop, because even a clumsy elbow might be turned into tonight's punishment, and punishment comes wrapped in jest. Quirky stories from later historians tell us that Caligula would sometimes order senators' wives to sit beside him, perhaps even demand they follow him from the feast for private encounters, then return them later, mocking their husbands in public. Imagine the forced smiles, the strained chuckles, the senators biting their tongues so hard that coppery blood laces their wine. You, reclining among them, feel your stomach twist, because at any moment your own dignity could become dessert. Historians still argue whether these lurid tales are exaggerated. Some suggest they were Roman satire, stories spun after his death to stain his memory. Others insist that they reflect truth, for too many sources repeat the themes of humiliation and excess. The ambiguity itself becomes part of the dread. The emperor's reputation is so tangled that you can't tell where fact ends and rumour begins. And in the moment, for the victims, rumour or fact mattered little. The humiliation felt real enough. The banquets also carried divine undertones. At times, Caligula appeared dressed as gods, Apollo, Mercury, even Jupiter. You imagine him rising from the couch, gleaming in golden fabric, demanding libations poured not to Jupiter but to himself. The hall glows with torchlight, and the musicians scramble to change their tune to something more solemn. In that instant, you are not just guests, but worshippers, pressed into a ritual disguised as dinner. But sometimes the feast tilted into farce. A fringe account tells of Caligula serving guests bread made from gilded flour, or meals that looked sumptuous but proved inedible, simply to watch their reactions. Was this madness or satire? Perhaps both. To watch a noble chew anxiously on tasteless crumbs while smiling in false delight must have been his kind of theatre. Imagine the laughter bubbling from his lips, the sharp clink of his goblet against marble, while everyone else struggles to decide whether to laugh with him or choke in silence. The soundscape of these nights is vivid. Flutes warble nervously, dancers' anklets jingle, Laughter bursts in sudden jarring notes, and always beneath it runs the low murmur of survival. Every guest rehearses their reactions, delight at the right moment, horror when appropriate, awe when demanded. You too would need to practice your face in a mirror, the right mix of reverence and amusement, the mask of compliance polished as carefully as the silver dishes. You sense how food itself becomes a prop. Ostrich eggs might be cracked open to reveal jewels instead of yolks. A roasted boar might be carried in stuffed with live birds, which fly shrieking into the rafters when carved open. The crowd gasps, but no one dares ask whether this is meant to amaze or mock. Caligula simply smiles, watching the confusion ripple outward like a stone in water. Mainstream Roman dining custom involved reclining on couches, 3 to a side, around a U-shaped arrangement of tables called a triclinium. But in Caligula's version, even the architecture seemed warped by whim. Some nights the tables might be stretched endlessly, forcing guests to crane their necks to catch a glimpse of him. Other nights the tables might be small, intimate, forcing rivals into uncomfortably close quarters. The stage changed constantly, like scenery in a play, reminding you that you were never in control. Quirky stories abound. One source claims that he once invited guests to a feast, only to auction their possessions during the meal, selling estates and treasures as though the owners were already dead. Imagine eating olives while your villa is sold off across the room, the audience chuckling nervously at your loss. You can almost hear the sound of the auctioneer's chant mingling with the scrape of knives on silver plates. Historians still argue whether these banquets were simply cruelty or carefully engineered demonstrations of power. Was the point to feed his appetite, or to show that senators, nobles, even generals were nothing more than pawns? Perhaps both. Power tastes sweeter, after all, when seasoned with the salt of someone else's humiliation. The mood at these banquets is not constant. Sometimes the emperor turns generous, tossing gold coins into the crowd of servants, showering the hall with gifts. For a moment the air lifts, laughter feels genuine, and you imagine perhaps this night will end kindly. But then the gifts vanish, replaced by commands, and the pendulum swings back into dread. This unpredictability becomes the flavour of every meal, sweet, bitter, sour, and always spiced with fear. As you recline on your couch, watching roasted meats carved, you realise the meal is not about food at all. It is about seeing who will bend, who will break, who will pretend hardest. It is about pressing Rome's elite into the roles of jesters, servants, and worshippers. And it is about reminding them that the emperor's appetite is not for delicacies, but for obedience. A mainstream fact anchors again. Ancient Roman authors recorded these feasts as both rumour and record. The details differ, but the theme of excess, both culinary and theatrical, runs consistently through their accounts. It was not simply the amount of food, but the twisted ritual of it that lodged in memory. And a quirky little detail lingers like a final sip of wine. Caligula was said to sometimes laugh suddenly during meals, as though struck by a joke only he understood. When pressed, he explained he was thinking how easily he could have any guest's throat cut at that very moment. Imagine trying to swallow roasted pheasant while those words hang in the air. The meat turns dry in your mouth, your goblet trembles in your hand, and the hall feels colder despite the blaze of candles. Historians still debate whether these stories paint a true portrait or a caricature. Was he truly so cruel at every banquet, or were later writers feeding a legend of decadence? The uncertainty doesn't matter to you reclining on the couch. For you, every laugh, every cough, every twitch of an eyebrow could decide your fate. And that's the essence of Caligula's banquets, the knowledge that you too are on stage, and that your performance must please an audience of one. As you leave the hall, the air outside feels lighter, but your stomach churns, not from the food, you barely tasted it, but from the weight of the spectacle. Rome's banquets under Caligula were not feasts of nourishment, but of fear, indulgence, and humiliation, and every guest walked away full yet empty, nourished yet drained. You step into the moonlit gardens, hearing the faint ripple of fountains, and you realise this was only one act of the emperor's theatre. Beyond the banquets lie temples, palaces, and rituals that will push the boundaries further still. The night stretches ahead, and the feast is only beginning. You walk out from the banquet halls, your ears still ringing with laughter that felt more like a threat than a joy. The night air cools your skin, yet you sense little relief, because Rome under Caligula never truly sleeps. Torches sputter outside temples, their flames throwing long shadows that seem to twist like spirits. Marble statues gleam as if alive, their carved eyes watching you. Tonight, the Emperor has chosen his grandest stage, not the triclinium of feasts or the corridors of his palace, but the very temples where gods themselves once held authority. Caligula does not want to worship here. He wants to be worshipped. You step into the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. The columns rise around you like titanic ribs, the air rich with incense and murmured prayers. Ordinarily you would expect solemnity, citizens bowing low, priests murmuring invocations. But now, in the glow of 1,000 oil lamps, something is different. The Emperor strides into the space not as a supplicant, but as though he owns it. His robes shimmer with gold thread, his head crowned with a laurel that looks suspiciously like a diadem. When he raises his arms, the crowd shifts uneasily. You realise he's not leading them in prayer, he's demanding their reverence. A mainstream fact grounds you here. Caligula ordered temples to display his statues alongside those of the gods, even demanding that some shrines to Jupiter be rededicated to himself. Ancient authors record that he commissioned colossal images of his likeness dressed as gods, and even tried to have his statue installed in the great temple at Jerusalem. Though this last effort enraged the Judeans and was halted, it demonstrates the audacity of his divine self-fashioning. You watch him step onto the altar as though it were a stage. His voice, high-pitched but commanding, echoes off the marble. He proclaims himself not merely emperor but divine, Jupiter's equal, Apollo's successor, Mercury's heir. The priests falter, uncertain whether to correct or comply, but Caligula allows no hesitation. You sense how uncomfortable it feels to stand in a temple meant for gods, while a mortal man demands the offerings. Yet in that moment, no one dares resist. Quirky anecdotes cling to this behaviour like ivy on a ruined wall. Some sources suggest Caligula enjoyed dressing in the costumes of various gods and goddesses, once appearing as Apollo with flowing robes, another time as Venus, adorned in feminine jewels. Imagine the senators' faces frozen between shock and awe, unsure whether to laugh or bow. The Emperor's gender-bending theatre was not simply indulgence. It was power, bending cultural norms until they snapped. Historians still argue whether these performances were blasphemous arrogance, political satire, or evidence of mental instability. Some suggest he did it deliberately to provoke the Senate, to show that even Rome's sacred traditions bowed before him. Others believe he truly believed himself divine, intoxicated by the roar of crowds and the endless cycle of adoration and fear. The truth flickers like torchlight, uncertain, unstable, yet undeniable in its impact. You step into another temple, this one smaller, more intimate. A statue of Castor and Pollux stands tall, twin brothers who were protectors of Rome. But tonight the Emperor climbs the steps, places himself between them, and gestures for offerings to be laid at his feet. You hear coins clinking into basins, jars of wine poured, wreaths laid gently, not for the gods, but for him. The symbolism is clear. Where once Rome bowed to divine twins, now it bows to one man. The atmosphere is surreal. Citizens who once whispered prayers now whisper about survival. Priests who studied rituals for decades now scramble to invent liturgies that honour the emperor as god. Children stare wide-eyed, learning early that worship in Rome has changed shape. And you, standing quietly in the back, realise that the sacred is no longer separate. It is fused with politics, twisted into theatre. A mainstream fact to steady you. Rome had long flirted with divine emperors. Augustus had been deified after death, and Tiberius resisted such honours in life. But Caligula was the first to demand worship openly while alive, breaking the thin veil of modesty that had kept earlier rulers restrained. It is as if the curtain separating mortal from divine has been ripped down, and the emperor now struts on stage in the god's costume. Quirky tales heighten the strangeness. One account claims Caligula built a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae, riding across it dressed as a god, claiming to outshine even Alexander the Great. Picture the shimmering water, the creak of wooden planks, soldiers stationed along the makeshift roadway, and the emperor riding proudly as crowds stare. Was it madness or genius? Historians still argue whether it was a vanity project, a political stunt, or simply an extravagant dare. The citizens, of course, can do nothing but adapt. At festivals, processions once meant to honour Jupiter now include images of Caligula. Priests stumble through prayers that merge divine names with his. Coins minted during his reign show him with radiant crowns, symbols of divinity pressed into silver and bronze. Even money whispers that he is no longer mortal. You hold one of those coins in your palm, the metal warm, the emperor's face gleaming up at you like the moon itself. But beneath the grandeur, you sense fear. If you hesitate in prayer, will someone report you? If you mutter doubts in the marketplace, will a soldier overhear? The emperor's demand for worship creates a new economy of suspicion, where every gesture of reverence must be perfect, every word polished, every bow deep enough. The city itself begins to feel like a temple, where the emperor is both god and high priest, and you, every citizen, are trapped as worshippers. Historians still puzzle over the meaning. Was Caligula's divine theatre truly accepted by the people, or was it endured in silence? Were his acts the wild delusions of a man unmoored, or a calculated campaign to dominate not only politics but spirituality? The lack of clarity makes it all the more unsettling. You cannot pin him down, and neither could those who lived under him. As you leave the temple, the night sky arches overhead, dotted with stars. The constellations themselves seem quieter, as though even the heavens hesitate. Rome no longer feels like a city of gods, but the private stage of one mortal man who dared to claim divinity. You sense how exhausting it must have been, day after day, to live in such theatre, to wake up each morning wondering which god he would play today, which ritual he would rewrite, which sacred space he would occupy. The marble steps chill your feet, and you realize you are still at the beginning of his divine play. Beyond these temples lie chambers where mirrors multiply his presence, and the emperor's theatre grows ever stranger, ever more intimate. Tonight the gods themselves seem forced into the audience, and you follow their gaze deeper into the story. You leave the temple courts behind and return to the palace, though now it feels transformed in your mind. No longer just marble and bronze, the place seems alive, humming like a theatre dressing room where every corridor is a backstage passage. You step inside and notice immediately that the palace has become a labyrinth of reflections. Torches flicker against polished surfaces, and every angle catches your own face staring back at you, multiplied, distorted, watching. For Caligula, the palace is not merely a home. It is a stage set, a mirror house of illusions designed to magnify himself and diminish everyone else. You sense it as soon as you walk the halls, how rooms have been rearranged to confuse, how reflective mosaics scatter torchlight like applause, how curtains hide alcoves where listeners wait to catch every whisper. This is the Emperor's Palace of Mirrors, a place where reality fractures and performance never ends. A mainstream fact anchors you here. The Palatine Hill was the site of Rome's imperial residences. Caligula expanded his quarters extravagantly, linking buildings into sprawling complexes that blended opulence with intimidation. Later emperors would remodel or destroy parts of it, but during his reign the palace itself reflected his personality, lavish, theatrical and suffocating. You wander into a chamber lined with polished bronze panels that shimmer like still pools of water. Servants glide along the edges, their sandals silent, their eyes downcast. At the centre reclines the emperor, his pale features lit unevenly so that one side glows while the other lies in shadow. Behind him mirrors catch and multiply his image. Caligula crowned, Caligula smiling, Caligula scowling, Caligula eternal. You realise this is no accident. He arranges his surroundings so that his image dominates every perspective. You cannot escape him, even when you turn your head. Quirky anecdotes cling to these mirrored halls. Some suggest Caligula enjoyed surprising guests by appearing suddenly from hidden doors, as if conjured by the mirrors themselves. Imagine reclining at a banquet, glancing into a reflection, and realising the emperor has materialised behind you, silent, smirking. Your heart leaps, your wine sloshes, and he delights in the panic. For him, every corridor is a stage for surprise entrances, every reflection a chance to rehearse an identity. Historians still argue whether Caligula's use of reflective surfaces and theatrical settings was mere vanity or a calculated political tactic. Was he simply obsessed with his own image, or did he understand how mirrors amplify awe, creating the illusion of omnipresence? Perhaps both. For when you see him multiplied in bronze and glass, You feel not just vanity but strategy, a ruler who ensures that even his absence feels like presence. Step deeper into his private chambers and you notice how intimacy itself becomes theatre. Bedrooms are decorated not for rest but for spectacle. Drapes shimmer like stage curtains. Couches are arranged for audiences, and every object seems placed for dramatic effect. Even pleasure becomes performance, with courtiers and companions reduced to actors in his nightly plays. You realise that nothing here is private, not truly. Even behind locked doors, the mirrors watch, recording silently in reflections. A mainstream fact steadies you. Roman emperors were known for constructing elaborate palatial complexes. Caligula's expansions included gardens, baths, and reception halls that blurred the line between private and public. Yet his use of the palace as a constant stage stands out. Later writers describe it as a place where reality bent under his whims, where each chamber became a prop in his drama of power. Quirky stories rise like smoke. One tale insists that Caligula built tunnels and passageways, linking his palace to the theatres and amphitheatres, so he could appear suddenly among the crowds or withdraw unseen. Whether literal or figurative, the idea fits. He lived like an actor ready to step into the spotlight at will. The city itself was his playhouse, and the palace the wings from which he entered. Historians still argue whether these tales exaggerate his theatricality. Did he truly see himself as a living god moving through mirrored halls, or have later storytellers magnified his eccentricities? You pause to consider, but the reflections offer no answer. They only multiply the questions. Imagine being a senator summoned here. You climb marble steps, your heart pounding, your toga heavy with sweat. You enter a hall where every wall reflects the emperor's image. You kneel, but even as you bow, his face looms from the corners of your vision, smirking at your obedience. You try to speak, but your own voice sounds hollow, swallowed by the echoes of laughter bouncing from polished surfaces. The palace itself conspires against you, reminding you that you are not the star. You are the audience, the extra, the disposable understudy. And the emperor knows it. He arranges encounters like scenes. A visitor enters, is startled by his sudden appearance, stammers a greeting, and Caligula delivers his line, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, always unexpected. The court holds its breath, waiting for the cue, laughter, applause, or silence. Even humiliation is scripted, though never predictable. One night he might mock a senator's baldness, another he might compliment it as divine resemblance to Jupiter. You never know the role you will play until he writes it on the spot. A quirky detail floats from the palace walls. Caligula was rumoured to sleep little, often roaming his halls at night, demanding companions to join him in sudden games, songs, or conversations. Imagine being jolted awake at midnight, summoned to a mirrored chamber where the emperor demands a hymn, a riddle, or a confession. The palace never rests, and neither do you. Its mirrors shimmer day and night, reminders that performance is endless. Historians still debate the cause of his restless nights. Some suggest illness, others paranoia, others sheer energy. Whatever the reason, the effect is clear. The palace becomes a place where time itself dissolves. There is no day or night, no waking or sleeping, only endless theatre under torchlight and reflection. You pause in a long gallery where bronze panels stretch into darkness. Your reflection follows you endlessly, ghostly companions marching beside you. You realise how disorienting it must have been for courtiers to live here. Always watched, always reflected, always uncertain whether the emperor himself might appear in the next mirror. Privacy vanishes, selfhood blurs. You become both actor and audience in a play you never auditioned for. A mainstream fact underscores the strangeness. Caligula was accused of paranoia, of fearing plots and conspiracies, and the palace architecture itself may have reflected that. Corridors twisted, guards stood at odd intervals, and mirrors offered both vanity and surveillance. The palace was both fortress and theatre, security and stagecraft intertwined. As you step back into the courtyard, the night sky spreads above you, but even here the marble pools reflect torchlight like broken stars. You realise the Palace of Mirrors is not confined to stone. It has seeped into Rome itself, into the Senate, into the temples, into every citizen's imagination. Caligula has multiplied himself until no corner of the city feels free from his gaze. Historians still argue whether this was madness or mastery, Was he trapped in his own reflections, unable to see beyond them? Or was he brilliantly manipulating appearances, making himself omnipresent in the minds of his subjects? You cannot decide. All you know is that the mirrors still shimmer, centuries later, and his face lingers there. You turn away, the torchlight fading behind you, and walk toward the next stage of his strange theatre, where language itself bends to his will, and even names are reshaped as part of his performance. You leave behind the mirrored corridors of the palace, though their reflections seem to cling to your thoughts, multiplying like echoes. The night carries you further into Caligula's reign, and you begin to notice something peculiar. Words themselves are bending, reshaped, as though language has become yet another stage prop. For the emperor, names are not fixed. They are malleable, pliant, tools to elevate himself or humiliate others. You step into the Senate chamber again, that solemn place of marble benches and carved pediments, but the atmosphere feels more like rehearsal than governance. The emperor strides in and announces with a smirk that this month shall no longer bear its ancient name. Instead, it will bear his own. Calendars are reprinted, festivals renamed, and the rhythm of time itself shifts under his whim. To live in Caligula's Rome is to find even the seasons hostage to his vanity. A mainstream fact anchors you. Several emperors attempted to rename months after themselves. Julius Caesar lent his name to July, Augustus to August. Caligula followed this precedent, but his changes did not endure. Still, the act reveals his belief that language, like stone, could be reshaped to reflect his glory. Imagine the confusion in marketplaces where citizens suddenly must remind each other not to say September, but Germanicus month. The tongue falters, the ear adjusts, but always the emperor's presence intrudes. You drift through the city, hearing names reshaped in stranger ways. Senators summoned to banquets might find themselves rechristened mid-meal, their family titles mocked or twisted into nicknames. Imagine sitting proudly, bearing the ancient lineage of a patrician house, only to have Caligula dub you with a farmhand's name before the crowd. You laugh weakly, bowing your head, because to resist is to invite ruin. In an instant, generations of dignity can be undone by a single word. Quirky tales abound. One account insists that Caligula, in his love of theatre, occasionally renamed his courtiers after characters in plays. A general becomes a tragic fool, a senator a buffoonish slave, a noblewoman a goddess of ridicule. These names stick, whispered in streets, repeated in gossip. The emperor delights in the transformation, watching men who once commanded legions squirm under the weight of silly stage names. Historians still argue whether these stories exaggerate the cruelty. Was Caligula truly renaming months and people so frivolously, or were later writers sharpening their satire? Yet even if half true, the effect remains chilling. To control names is to control identity, to make language itself bow to the throne. You feel it as you walk the streets, how even ordinary citizens hesitate before speaking, unsure whether the words they use are still allowed. You pause at a temple. Here too the power of naming has crept. The emperor demands dedications not to Jupiter or Mars, but to himself under divine epithets. The priests adjust their chants, stumbling over syllables as they fold the emperor's name into sacred hymns, a god's name erased, a mortal's inserted. The city's prayers themselves are rewritten, tongues reshaped in worship of one man. A mainstream fact sharpens the point. Caligula's demand for divine honours included being called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Later emperors, notably Domitian, would echo the phrase, but Caligula's insistence was among the earliest. Language, once sacred, became a badge of flattery. To call him anything less was dangerous. To call him more was impossible. So the people called him what he wished, even as their hearts faltered. Quirky details cling like burrs. Some say he forced citizens to swear oaths by his genius instead of by the gods. Imagine a merchant sealing a contract, once invoking Mercury or Fortuna, now compelled to swear by the emperor's name. The divine is replaced by a mortal signature, and suddenly every promise in Rome belongs to him. Even the marketplace becomes an extension of his theatre, the hum of commerce laced with his identity. Historians still argue whether his manipulation of names reflects delusion or strategy. Was he so consumed by vanity that he truly believed renaming months or titles made him eternal? Or did he understand the subtlety of language, how reshaping it reshapes thought, bending reality itself. Modern scholars debate, but the citizens living through it could not afford to. For them, every wrong word was a potential sentence. You wander through the forum, where gossip flows like water. Here you overhear stories of senators reduced to tears by new titles, of noble women reborn with mocking epithets. People repeat them quietly, half in laughter, half in fear. The words themselves are like little daggers, reminders that dignity is not yours to keep. It belongs to the emperor, who may take it with a phrase. Imagine being called to dinner. You arrive, carefully dressed, prepared to show respect. Suddenly, in front of everyone, Caligula declares that you shall no longer be Marcus, but donkey. The hall erupts in nervous laughter, and you must laugh too, even as humiliation sears your cheeks. From that day forward, whispers follow you in markets, in baths, in senate corridors. There goes donkey. All it took was a word. A mainstream fact steadies the scene. Romans believed strongly in the power of names. To rename was to redefine. Slaves, upon being freed, often took new names to mark their rebirth. Conquered lands were renamed to cement Roman authority. For an emperor to rename people, months or temples was not trivial. It was to seize control of identity and time itself. And yet, a quirky anecdote persists. Caligula's favourite horse, Incitatus, was said to be pampered with marble stables, and even considered for the consulship. Imagine senators choking on their wine as the emperor muses aloud about naming a horse to Rome's highest office. Whether satire or truth, the story demonstrates his use of naming as mockery. By elevating a horse to consul, he effectively calls senators beasts of burden. The insult is sharp, and the name, Consul Incitatus, lingers as both jest and wound. Historians still argue over this anecdote's authenticity. Was it a joke blown out of proportion, or a genuine threat to show the Senate their irrelevance? Either way, the power lies in the naming. To bestow titles frivolously is to reveal how fragile they are, how little they matter under imperial whim. You continue through the palace gardens, where fountains splash softly. Even here, naming asserts itself. Plants imported from distant provinces are rechristened with titles honouring the emperor. Statues bear inscriptions not of gods, but of Caligula's chosen epithets. Every stone, every leaf, every carved letter whispers his name back at you. The city itself becomes a chorus repeating him endlessly, a litany of identity pressed into marble and breath. Historians still debate whether this obsession with naming reflects insecurity. Perhaps the emperor, born in trauma, needed constant reinforcement that he was more than mortal, more than the boy in boots. Perhaps reshaping names was his way of reshaping himself, forcing the world to forget the shadows of his childhood. Or perhaps he simply delighted in the theatre of it, savouring the humiliation of others as part of his nightly entertainment. You pause and glance back toward the mirrored palace. Now you see how the two connect. The mirrors multiplied his image, the renaming multiplied his presence. Where reflections ensured his face was everywhere, names ensured his identity filled every ear. Between sight and sound he conquered perception itself. The night deepens, the stars overhead blotted by torch smoke. You feel weary, as though language itself weighs heavier on your tongue. To live in Caligula's Rome is to carry not only fear of action but fear of speech, where even words betray you. You whisper his name softly, uncertain whether the air itself listens. And you realise this too is only one act in his strange theatre. Beyond names lie bonds more intimate still, those of family, of sisters drawn into his spotlight. And there, the play grows darker, the whispers sharper, the stage more perilous. You step away from the echo of renamed months and senators christened with insults, only to find yourself walking deeper into chambers where family itself has been turned into theatre. The palace grows hushed, its torchlight softer here, its marble corridors narrowing into private apartments. These are not halls for the Senate or feasts for nobles. These are the spaces where Caligula's sisters lived. Sisters who would, unwillingly or not, become the most dazzling and dangerous actors in his peculiar drama. You pause at a doorway carved with garlands, where silken curtains ripple faintly in the breeze. Behind them, you imagine the laughter of young women raised in privilege but shadowed by loss. Agrippina the Younger, Julia Drusilla, and Julia Livilla. 3 names that history remembers less for their own deeds than for the scandal that clung to them. The sisters of Caligula were not merely relatives, they were symbols, confidants, and according to ancient gossip, unwilling props in his theatre of excess. A mainstream fact steadies you. Roman aristocratic women were often thrust into political marriages, pawns in dynastic games. Caligula's sisters were no exception. They were daughters of Germanicus, nieces of Tiberius, and thus carried dynastic weight. Their presence at court was both prestigious and perilous, for proximity to power meant proximity to danger. Yet Caligula elevated them unusually high. You picture him leading them into the forum, parading them beside him as though they were equals in rule. Their portraits appeared on coins, a shocking break from tradition, since women rarely shared such honours during a reigning emperor's life. You hold such a coin in your hand, its metal cool, and see the sisters' profiles pressed into eternity beside their brothers. To Rome, the message is clear. These women are not merely family, but part of the imperial theatre itself. Quirky tales flutter around them like moths to a flame. Ancient writers whisper that Caligula was unnaturally close to Drusilla, the sister he seemed to favour most. He reportedly doted on her, took her everywhere, and, according to rumour, declared her his consort in all but name. When she died suddenly in AD 38, he ordered mourning rituals usually reserved for wives, even declaring a period of public grief that suspended business across the city. Imagine walking through the forum, shops shuttered, temples draped in black, as though a goddess had died. The people bow their heads not just in respect but in bewilderment. Why is a sister honoured as though she were empress? Historians still argue whether these rumours of incest were truth or slander. Roman authors loved scandal, and few figures drew more lurid storytelling than Caligula. Some scholars suggest the intimacy was exaggerated to tarnish him posthumously, while others believe his actions genuinely blurred boundaries. The truth remains tangled in shadows, but the effect is undeniable. Rome saw a brother treating his sisters in ways that unsettled tradition, raising them into the spotlight where rumour fed eagerly. You wander into a garden court where vines twist around marble columns. Here you imagine the sisters walking in fine linen, their sandals tapping gently against stone, their voices murmuring in the dusk. To ordinary eyes they might seem safe in the palace's protection, yet you know better. Their elevation tied them to their brother's whims, and every whisper of scandal wrapped tighter around their throats. Agrippina the Younger, especially, would later navigate the empire's stage with terrifying skill, eventually mothering another infamous emperor, Nero. But for now she is young, bright-eyed, learning early how survival depends on embracing or evading her brother's spotlight. A mainstream fact steadies you further. Caligula restored his sisters after years of exile under Tiberius. Their return to Rome signalled a new era, at first celebrated. The people cheered the reunion of Germanicus's children, as though destiny itself had healed old wounds. Yet the joy did not last, for soon the sisters were entangled in plots, accusations, and the ever-shifting loyalties of palace politics. Quirky details glimmer. Some say Caligula dined with them publicly, reclining beside them in the manner of a husband with a wife. Others claim he invoked their names in oaths, swearing by Drusilla instead of Jupiter, bending the sacred language of Rome into personal devotion. Imagine a senator forced to echo such an oath, his tongue tripping over the blasphemy, his face burning as he swears loyalty by the emperor's sister rather than a god. The lines between family, divinity, and governance blur into a tangle. Historians still argue whether Caligula's treatment of his sisters reflects affection, obsession, or strategy. Perhaps he elevated them to strengthen his dynasty, projecting the image of a divine family ruling together. Perhaps he indulged genuine devotion, especially toward Drusilla, or perhaps he delighted in the scandal, enjoying how Rome squirmed at the sight of boundaries crossed. Each interpretation shifts the light, yet all cast shadows long enough to unsettle. You step into the chamber where Drusilla's death is remembered. The air is heavy with incense, the walls hung with dark drapery. Citizens once entered here, compelled to mourn as though she were divine. Caligula himself wept publicly, refusing food for days, declaring her not only sister but goddess. You imagine the torchlight flickering on his tear-streaked face, the crowd hushed, uncertain whether to join his grief or fear his wrath if they did not. To mourn is natural. To deify a sibling is something else entirely. The coinage tells its own story. Drusilla was declared Panthea, or goddess, her image stamped on coins like that of Venus or Juno. You hold such a coin again, the silver glinting under moonlight, and realise how deeply Caligula intertwined family and divinity. His sister is no longer mortal, she is myth, transformed by naming and ritual into eternal companion. Yet in the streets the gossip grows louder. If the emperor treats his sister as goddess wife, what else lies behind palace doors? A quirky tidbit drifts from the gossip. Some said Caligula once dined openly with his sisters in the role of Jupiter, while they played Juno and Minerva, enacting the divine triad. Whether staged play or private joke, the symbolism is potent. The emperor reshapes family into pantheon, his own bloodline into Olympus reborn. And Rome, uneasy, watches from the shadows. Historians still argue whether these staged roles were political theatre or personal delusion. Was he declaring a divine dynasty, raising his sisters as co-rulers in symbolic guise? Or was it pure indulgence, a fantasy enacted at the expense of tradition? The evidence is murky, yet the sensation is clear. Rome felt itself slipping into a drama it had not rehearsed, forced to accept roles that defied sense. You pause in the gardens again, listening to the fountains trickle. You imagine the sisters whispering here, sharing fears, perhaps even resentment. To be loved by Caligula was as perilous as to be hated. His affection could elevate, but it also entangled, exposing them to scandal, envy, and danger. For Agrippina and Livilla, survival would mean distance. But distance was not always possible in a palace where mirrors multiplied every gesture and whispers grew like vines. A mainstream fact returns like an anchor. Within a few years, Agrippina and Livilla fell from grace, accused of conspiracy, exiled, and left to wither far from the palace spotlight. The spotlight that once illuminated them became a burning lamp, exposing them to ruin. Their brother, once their protector, became their jailer. And so the sisters' story turns from elevation to collapse, a tragedy rehearsed under torchlight and rumour. As you leave the chamber, the night air brushes your face, cooler now, more solemn. You realise that family, which should have been sanctuary, became another stage for Caligula's theatre. Sisters who might have lived quietly became symbols of scandal, goddesses in rumour, pawns in dynastic games. And as you walk onward, you sense the stage widening again. Soon it will not be confined to family or palace, but spill into the public sphere, where all of Rome is forced to watch, and sometimes participate, in the emperor's unsettling theatre of desire. You step out from the intimate shadows of the sisters' chambers and into Rome's streets again, only to find the entire city reshaped into a stage. No longer confined to palaces, temples, or mirrored galleries, Caligula's appetite for theatre spills out into the open. The citizens themselves become unwilling actors in a public drama that blurs politics, ritual, and scandal. You join the crowd as it flows through the forum, past the marble arches and bronze statues, towards spaces where the emperor arranges not governance but performances. You hear it before you see it. The roar of voices from the Circus Maximus, the thunder of hooves, the clatter of chariots racing across sand. Ordinarily these games are Roman tradition, entertainment offered by emperors to win favour. But tonight feels different. The races stall, the announcer hesitates, and suddenly the emperor rises in his imperial box. He is dressed not as a ruler, but as an actor, perhaps in a god's costume, perhaps in something stranger. He commands silence, and thousands obey, the crowd holding its collective breath, waiting for his whim. A mainstream fact steadies you. Roman emperors often use the games as public propaganda. Augustus sponsored spectacles to display generosity. Tiberius used them cautiously. But Caligula infused them with unsettling theatricality. Ancient authors describe him halting races, insulting crowds, or turning spectacles into platforms for his personal amusement. Imagine being one of 150,000 packed into the Circus Maximus, the sand hot under the sun, and suddenly realising the entertainment has shifted from sport to imperial performance. Quirky anecdotes stick like burrs. One tale claims Caligula once ordered an entire section of the crowd executed because they displeased him during the games. Another insists he halted a chariot race to berate nobles for not cheering loudly enough. Whether exaggerated or not, the mood they capture is real. Fear mingling with spectacle. a theatre where the audience is never safe. Historians still argue whether such stories are slander from later writers, eager to paint him monstrous. Yet the consistency of these accounts suggests truth at the core, that Caligula saw the games not as gifts to the people, but as stages for his control. You drift with the crowd into the theatre. Ordinarily, actors perform comedies, tragedies, and pantomimes here, but tonight the emperor himself strides onto the stage. He may sing, dance, or declaim lines from myth. His gestures grand, his voice shrill. The audience claps desperately, unsure whether the performance is meant as parody or proclamation. You imagine the senators in the front row, their hands aching from forced applause, their faces frozen in masks of admiration. To boo is death. To cheer too little is danger. To cheer too much risks mockery. There is no safe role. A mainstream fact here. Caligula was fascinated by theatre, often participating in performances himself. Ancient accounts describe him dressing as gods, heroes, even women, and forcing senators and nobles to attend. Roman tradition frowned upon emperors acting on stage. It blurred the boundary between ruler and performer. Yet Caligula embraced it, revelling in the shock. Quirky details abound. Some stories claim he forced senators to dance on stage, humiliating them before crowds. Others whisper he selected noblewomen from the audience, parading them publicly as if they were actresses in his play. Imagine the discomfort. Rome's most prestigious families dragged into the spotlight, stripped of dignity, reduced to roles in the emperor's nightly performance. Historians still argue whether he meant these acts as deliberate humiliation or simply indulgence, perhaps both. By forcing Rome's elite to become performers, he reminded them that their power meant nothing without his script. You wander into another square where statues tower. The emperor arrives, his guards pushing crowds aside, and suddenly a ritual unfolds. He orders altars built on the spot, sacrifices conducted in his honour, chants sung not to Jupiter but to himself. Citizens kneel, their knees bruising on cobblestones, their voices cracking as they try to match the rhythm. You feel their unease. The sacred is twisted, the public square turned into stage scenery. A mainstream fact steadies again. Caligula indeed staged rituals where he blurred worship of gods with worship of himself. Ancient authors note his attempts to fuse his cult with traditional Roman religion, pressing the populace into participation. Quirky stories swirl. One tale insists he paraded through Rome in female attire, demanding the crowd worship him as Venus. Another claims he appeared as Hercules brandishing a club, his pale body straining under borrowed costume. Whether literal or symbolic, these tales highlight the theatre of desire he projected, forcing the city to witness his shifting identities. Historians still argue whether these cross-costumed appearances were acts of religious syncretism, theatrical jest, or delusion. The uncertainty fuels the dread. When every day might bring a new role, the city learns to adapt quickly, rehearsing reverence for whichever god mask he wears. Imagine the ordinary citizen. You rise at dawn, hoping for a day of quiet labour, only to be swept into the forum where the emperor demands your presence. Suddenly you are kneeling, chanting, clapping, playing a role in a ritual you do not understand. You go home exhausted, not from work, but from performance. To live in Caligula's Rome is to live in constant rehearsal for plays that never end. A quirky detail clings here. Some said he would stop in taverns disguised, mingling briefly with ordinary citizens, then later reveal himself, laughing at their shock. Was it paranoia, testing loyalty, or a craving for attention, ensuring he was recognised everywhere? The city could never know. Historians still argue whether these tales reflect paranoia, indulgence, or simple rumour, but the fear they inspired was real enough. You never knew when the emperor was watching, listening, waiting to turn you into his next spectacle. The atmosphere grows heavy as you walk with the crowd at dusk. Torches flicker in the forum, casting long shadows across marble statues. The city feels weary, drained by constant participation. It is one thing to cheer at games or laugh at plays. It is another to be forced into them, to be reminded daily that your body, your voice, even your silence belong to the emperor's theatre, and you realise something crucial. This public theatre of desire is not only about indulgence, it is about power. By blurring worship and performance, intimacy and humiliation, Caligula demonstrates that no boundary is sacred, no role safe. Senators, citizens, priests and prostitutes alike are dragged into his stage. Rome itself becomes the set, its people the actors, its gods the backdrop. Historians still argue whether this was madness or mastery. Was Caligula simply deluded, believing himself divine actor of the world? Or was he deliberately eroding boundaries, ensuring that no one could stand outside his theatre? The answer remains elusive, but as you stand in the torchlit forum, you feel the truth in your bones. Under Caligula, Rome itself has become performance art, and no one, not even you, can refuse the role. You step back into the night, your feet aching from the endless standing ovations demanded. Ahead lie darker rituals still, sacrifices twisted, games of humiliation sharpened, ceremonies stripped of meaning and turned into cruel parody. The curtain has not fallen. The play only deepens. The torchlit forum fades behind you, and the night air grows heavier as you drift toward the sacred precincts of Rome, places where the smell of incense hangs thick, and the marble altars gleam with bloodstains scrubbed daily by weary priests. Normally, these are spaces where ritual sacrifice holds the city together, where oxen, sheep, and doves are offered to gods in carefully choreographed rites that reassure Romans that the divine order is secure. Yet under Caligula, these ceremonies lose their balance. You sense it as you step closer to a temple court. The sacrifices are no longer gifts to Jupiter, Juno, or Mars. They are theatre for the emperor, spectacles bent to his will. The air is smoky, the crowd restless. A bull snorts on the altar, its muscles trembling as priests prepare their knives. But then Caligula arrives, draped in gold, flanked by guards and musicians. The ritual halts. All eyes turn to him. He raises his hand, and suddenly the sacrifice feels different. No longer an offering from the people to the gods, it is an offering from Rome to Caligula himself, as though the beast blood will nourish not Olympus, but the emperor's appetite for awe. A mainstream fact steadies you. Roman religion was deeply public and political. Sacrifices were performed to ensure divine favour for the state, with emperors participating as chief priests. Caligula, however, blurred the lines, demanding sacrifices for his own genius, twisting sacred rites into performances centred on his divinity. Quirky stories cluster like moths to flame. Some say Caligula occasionally ordered sacrifices of unusual animals, not the customary oxen or sheep, but exotic beasts brought from distant provinces. Imagine an ostrich, bewildered, tethered in the temple, its long neck craning toward the sky as the crowd gasps. Or perhaps a giraffe, trembling as priests glance nervously at one another, wondering how to slit the throat of such a strange creature. Whether literal or exaggerated, these tales capture the absurdity. The emperor reshaping ritual not for piety but for spectacle. Historians still argue whether he truly imported such exotic sacrifices or whether satirists embellished the accounts. Yet even if metaphor, the symbolism is sharp. Under Caligula, religion itself bends into parody, the altar turned into stage scenery. You walk among the crowd, their faces pale in the torchlight. The citizens chant, but their voices lack conviction. They know the gods are supposed to be the focus, but their eyes never leave the emperor. If he nods, the ritual continues. If he frowns, the ritual halts. You sense the unease. When worship becomes theatre for a mortal man, what room is left for the divine? A mainstream fact anchors again. Caligula was Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. In this role he presided over ceremonies, but unlike predecessors, he made them about himself. Ancient writers report he demanded temples be rededicated to him, that sacrifices honour his genius rather than Jupiter's. Quirky anecdotes sparkle with unsettling detail. One account claims that when a shortage of animals occurred, Caligula ordered human sacrifices, criminals thrown to beasts in public games under the guise of ritual. Imagine standing in the amphitheatre, expecting gladiators, only to see condemned prisoners dragged into the arena and slaughtered, as though their deaths were offerings to the emperor's divinity. Whether framed as justice or worship, the result is the same. Blood spilled not for gods, but for the emperor's glory. Historians still argue about the reliability of these accounts. Roman authors often painted unpopular emperors with lurid colours, eager to highlight cruelty. Yet the persistence of these stories suggests Caligula did manipulate sacrifice, pushing boundaries until they cracked. You linger in the temple court as the bull finally collapses, blood steaming in the cool night air. The crowd murmurs, the priests chant, but the emperor does not look heavenward. He watches the crowd. His eyes gleam as he measures their reactions. To him, the sacrifice is not about pleasing the gods. It is about controlling the people, reminding them that life and death, piety and blasphemy, all run through him. A mainstream fact offers more. Caligula restored and expanded several temples, including those dedicated to Castor and Pollux, but he used them for his own appearances, even receiving visitors there as though from a throne. Sacred space became personal palace. Quirky tidbits cling to this blasphemy. Some say he conversed with statues of gods, whispering to them as companions, even laughing at their silence. Others claim he ordered the heads of famous deities removed and replaced with his own likeness. Imagine walking into a temple expecting Jupiter's stern face, only to find Caligula's smirk gazing down from the altar. The dissonance would rattle your bones. Historians still argue whether he truly defaced divine statues or whether these were symbolic acts magnified by later scandal. But the impression is clear. Under Caligula, Rome's gods no longer ruled. They were props in his performance, scenery in his grand theatre. You feel the weight of this shift in the city's rhythm. Festivals once meant for communal joy now become tense displays of obedience. Priests once confident in their roles now stumble, unsure how to adapt rituals to include the emperor's demands. Citizens who once prayed sincerely now mutter rote chants, hoping only to avoid notice. Religion, once anchor of the state, has become unstable, tilted by the emperor's whim. The atmosphere in the temples grows oppressive. You smell incense, but it stings your nose. You hear chants, but they sound hollow. Even the statues seem uneasy, their stone eyes dulled by humiliation. You realise you are standing in a Rome where the gods themselves appear trapped in Caligula's theatre, forced to share their altars with a mortal actor who insists on being worshipped. A quirky story sharpens the unease. Caligula was said to have laughed during sacrifices, mocking the solemnity of priests. Imagine a high priest lifting his knife, his voice quivering with holy words, only to hear the emperor giggling behind him. The laughter spreads uneasily until the entire ritual collapses into parody. Was it satire, cruelty, madness? Historians still argue. The crowd, however, remembers only the humiliation. As you drift out of the temple, the night feels heavier than before. Smoke lingers in your clothes, the echo of chants in your ears. You realise sacrifices, once binding Rome to its gods, now bind Rome to its emperor. Blood spilled no longer climbs toward Olympus. It pools at the emperor's feet, reflecting torchlight like liquid mirrors. Historians still argue whether Caligula's manipulation of sacrifice was deliberate policy or reckless indulgence. Was he trying to reform religion into a cult of personality, or was he simply playing mocking tradition for his own amusement? The answer remains elusive. What you do know, as you step into the silent streets, is how profoundly unsettling it feels. To live in his Rome is to find no sanctuary, not even in temples. The torches flicker out one by one as you walk away, leaving only the stars above. Yet even they seem dimmer tonight, as though unwilling to shine on rituals so twisted. And ahead, you sense more darkness. Games not of sacrifice but of humiliation, staged not for gods but for men, where power itself becomes parody. You walk away from the smoke of the temple courts, your sandals striking against marble streets that echo faintly like drum beats. Rome feels unsettled, restless, as though the very paving stones hold their breath. You follow the hum of a gathering crowd drawn toward the heart of another performance. But this one is different, darker, stranger, less about gods and more about men. These are not rituals of sacrifice meant to impress Olympus. These are games staged to reduce senators, nobles, and citizens alike into puppets. You're about to witness Caligula's favourite pastime, the theatre of humiliation. You step into a vast reception hall where lamps burn low and couches are scattered in a semicircle. Guests shuffle nervously, their faces pale, their togas carefully arranged. You can feel their unease in the way they sip wine too quickly, in the way their laughter rings hollow, in the way their eyes dart toward the curtain behind which the emperor waits. Then he enters, his presence a spark that ignites tension. He is not dressed in imperial purple tonight, but in something more flamboyant. Perhaps a god's costume, perhaps a parody of one of his guests. The effect is the same. He sets the tone, and everyone else must follow. A mainstream fact steadies the scene. Caligula frequently humiliated senators and nobles, stripping them of dignity in ways that shocked contemporaries. Ancient authors note his habit of forcing senators to run beside his chariot, serve him at meals, or watch silently while he mocked them. Authority was inverted, and men who once ruled provinces were reduced to lackeys for his amusement. Quirky tales capture the cruelty in vivid strokes. One account says he invited senators to dinner, only to burst into laughter mid-meal. When asked why, he explained he had been imagining how easily he could order their execution and watch their heads fall onto their plates. Imagine trying to chew roasted boar with that statement hovering in the air. The silence thick enough to choke. Historians still argue whether such anecdotes reflect truth or satire. Yet the emotional reality is clear. Senators lived in constant fear of ridicule, their dignity always one jest away from destruction. You drift further into the scene. Tonight the Emperor has arranged a game. He summons a senator forward, an old man, his hands trembling. Caligula commands him to dance. The hall erupts in forced laughter as the dignified statesman, who once gave speeches in the forum, shuffles awkwardly to music. His feet stumble, his face burns, but he dares not stop. The Emperor claps mockingly, enjoying the sight of power reduced to parody. A mainstream fact underscores this inversion. Roman society was built on dignitas, the honour and respect owed to status. To strip a senator of it publicly was not just cruelty, it was political annihilation. Caligula knew this, and wielded it like a weapon. Quirky anecdotes multiply. Some claim he forced nobles to kiss his feet, others that he demanded senators run beside his litter in the streets like slaves. One tale even insists he made consuls act as attendants at his banquets, serving food like household staff. Imagine the whispers in the crowd. Men who once governed provinces now holding plates, their faces wooden masks of obedience. Historians still argue whether these humiliations were calculated or whimsical. Was Caligula deliberately dismantling the Senate's dignity to elevate his own power, or was he simply amused by the absurdity of noblemen degraded? The debate lingers, unresolved, like an echo in the marble hall. You step outside into the amphitheatre, where the atmosphere is even sharper. Citizens gather, expecting gladiators, but tonight the Emperor introduces a twist. Instead of trained fighters, nobles are pushed into the arena, forced to perform mock battles or absurd contests. Imagine senators stumbling in the sand, sweating under the jeers of the crowd, their fine sandals slipping as they swing wooden swords. The audience laughs nervously, then louder, caught between fear and entertainment. A mainstream fact steadies you. Emperors did control public games, and Caligula used them for personal amusement. Ancient sources record that he sometimes replaced scheduled performances with humiliating displays, mocking both audience and participants. Quirky stories abound. One suggests he once promised a spectacle of gladiators, but substituted it with condemned prisoners dressed in ridiculous costumes, forcing them to fight as parody. Another claims he ordered the arena flooded for mock sea battles, only to abandon the plan midway, leaving nobles wading in water like children. Whether true or embroidered, these stories reveal his taste for turning expectation into humiliation. Historians still argue whether these humiliations were remembered accurately or magnified by hostile authors, but the consistency of the theme, nobles reduced, rituals inverted, laughter sharpened into cruelty, suggests at least some truth. You glance at the faces in the stands. Some citizens laugh genuinely, enjoying the sight of elites humbled. Others force their smiles, aware that to appear sombre risks suspicion. The Emperor watches closely, his eyes scanning the crowd, measuring every reaction. You realise this is the heart of his theatre. The humiliation of a few becomes the performance of many, forcing the entire audience to participate in silent complicity. The atmosphere grows heavier. Imagine being one of those senators, your heart pounding as you kneel in sand, your dignity stripped, the crowd roaring. You tell yourself it is temporary, that tomorrow you will return to your villa, but you know the truth. The memory will haunt you forever. You're no longer Marcus, governor consul. You are Marcus, the emperor's fool. A quirky tidbit sharpens the cruelty. Some accounts say Caligula delighted in inviting nobles to banquets, only to auction their possessions during the meal, mocking their inability to stop him. Imagine sipping wine while hearing your villa sold to a stranger across the room, your laughter forced as though you find it amusing. This was humiliation not just of body but of wealth, identity, and legacy. Historians still argue whether these humiliations reveal a deliberate political strategy. Some scholars suggest Caligula was dismantling the Senate's power by stripping it of dignity, ensuring loyalty through fear. Others see only whimsical cruelty, a man-child playing with lives for entertainment. The truth perhaps is both. Strategy wrapped in indulgence, politics disguised as parody. As the night deepens, you drift away from the amphitheatre, your mind heavy with the images. Senators dancing like fools, nobles stumbling in sand, citizens laughing nervously. You realise humiliation has become ritual under Caligula, a new kind of sacrifice, not of bulls or sheep, but of dignity itself. And you sense this is only a step deeper into the abyss. Beyond humiliation lie ceremonies even stranger. Marriages staged as mockery, vows turned into theatre, unions crafted not for love but for shock. The emperor has not yet exhausted his playbook. The curtain rises still. You leave the amphitheatre behind, its sand still clinging to your imagination, echoing with the laughter that masked fear. But Rome does not rest. The city is caught in an endless cycle of performance, each act stranger than the last. Tonight you find yourself drawn back into the palace, where Caligula stages a new kind of play. Not gladiatorial games, not humiliations of senators, but mockery of Rome's most solemn bond, marriage itself. You step through a colonnade into a chamber hung with garlands of roses, their perfume thick enough to make you lightheaded. Musicians tune their lyres, guests murmur uneasily, and slaves sprinkle petals on the marble floor. At first glance it looks like the beginning of a wedding, an altar prepared, a priest waiting, a bride adorned. But the atmosphere is wrong. The laughter too brittle, the glances too nervous. This is not a ceremony of love. It is a stage set for Caligula's amusement. A mainstream fact steadies you. Caligula's reign was marked by bizarre and abrupt marriages. Ancient historians record that he took multiple wives in quick succession, sometimes marrying them only to discard them days later. His most notorious episode involved seizing a senator's bride during the wedding feast itself, claiming her as his own, and then casting her aside soon after. Imagine the scene. A senator beams with pride, his young bride veiled and radiant, the hall buzzing with celebration. Then Caligula arrives. He compliments the bride, lingers too long at her side, and finally declares she belongs to him. The music falters, the guests freeze, the groom swallows his protest. In an instant, vows are broken, families humiliated, and a marriage transformed into parody. You feel the sting of humiliation ripple through the hall, sharper than any sword. Quirky anecdotes add colour. Some say he staged multiple weddings in a single night, marrying and divorcing women with the ease of changing costumes. Others whisper that he forced couples to switch partners mid-ceremony, as though love itself were a prop to be rearranged for his laughter. Whether true or embroidered, the effect is the same. Rome's most sacred social bond reduced to mock theatre. Historians still argue whether these tales of marital mockery are exaggerations. Roman authors, hostile to Caligula, may have sharpened their pens with scandal. Yet the consistency of the stories, his disregard for marital sanctity, his habit of seizing wives, suggests at least a kernel of truth. And in a society where marriage was not only private but political, his mockery cut deeper than scandal. It destabilized trust in the entire order of Roman family life. You step deeper into the chamber, and the mock ceremony begins. The emperor himself plays priest, reciting vows with exaggerated solemnity, his voice rising into parody. The bride trembles, the groom forces a smile, the guests clap awkwardly. You sense how each gesture is a trap. To laugh too loudly is dangerous. To remain too solemn is worse. Everyone is caught in the web, forced to perform roles in a play they did not audition for. A mainstream fact grounds the grotesque comedy. Roman marriage ceremonies involved vows spoken before witnesses, exchange of rings or tokens, and a procession to the groom's house. Under Caligula, these steps were twisted. Witnesses became unwilling spectators, processions became spectacles, and vows were rewritten at his whim. Quirky tidbits emerge from gossip. One tale insists he forced high-ranking men to marry prostitutes in staged ceremonies, mocking both men and women alike. Another claims he once declared himself bridegroom and married a goddess's statue, treating the ritual as though it were holy union. Imagine standing in a temple, the emperor solemnly clasping the marble hand of Venus, the crowd stifling giggles, unsure whether to treat it as sacrilege or satire. Historians still argue whether such episodes were symbolic acts, political theatre meant to demonstrate divine connection, or mere indulgence in absurdity. The lack of clarity itself is the point. In Caligula's Rome, meaning was slippery, rituals unstable, and no bond sacred. The atmosphere in these mock marriages is suffocating. You feel it in the silence before each laugh, in the rustle of silk as brides fidget, in the clink of goblets as grooms drink too much to steady their nerves. Marriage, once a cornerstone of Roman society, becomes another prop in the emperor's endless performance. Husbands are humiliated, wives objectified, families disoriented. The emperor alone stands confident, master of every role. You imagine the senators afterward, trudging home with pale faces, their dignity shredded, their wives, their daughters, their very legacies twisted into jokes, and yet they cannot speak of it. To complain is treason, to laugh is complicity. So they sit in silence, pretending the ceremony was real, though every heartbeat tells them otherwise. A mainstream fact underlines the cruelty. Roman law treated marriage as a civic contract, binding families and securing inheritance. By mocking it, Caligula did not merely offend sensibilities, he undermined the foundations of Rome's social fabric. Quirky stories linger like sour wine. Some whisper he once married and divorced within a single day, parading his new bride through the forum only to send her home before dusk. Another tale says he married a woman purely to humiliate her husband, keeping her briefly before discarding her in public shame. Whether literal or exaggerated, the lesson is the same. Vows mean nothing, loyalty counts for little, and even love can be turned into theatre. Historians still argue over motive. Was Caligula genuinely incapable of understanding marriage as bond, seeing it only as performance? Or was he deliberately weaponizing it, reminding Rome that no union, however sacred, could stand above his whim? Scholars disagree, but the experience for contemporaries was the same: instability, fear, and humiliation. As you leave the chamber, the garlands of roses already wilting, you feel weary. The scent of petals cloys in your nostrils, the echo of forced laughter clings to your ears. Marriage, sacrifice, games, all twisted, all emptied of meaning. The emperor has turned even the most intimate human vows into parody, leaving nothing untouched, and yet, as you step into the night air, you sense more spectacle ahead. For Caligula's appetite is not confined to halls or temples. He carries it onto the sea itself, building floating palaces where rituals grow stranger still, where the boundary between land, water and sky blurs into fantasy. The curtain has not closed. The play drifts onward. The marble steps of the palace fall away behind you, and the night air sharpens with the smell of salt. A low murmur rises from the shore, waves lapping against wood, sailors calling to one another, torches glimmering on the water. You're walking toward Caligula's strangest stage of all, not the forum, not the temples, not even the mirrored halls of the Palatine, but the sea itself. Here, floating on the Bay of Baiae, he builds his fantasies into reality, vast ships that are less vessels and more palaces, playgrounds where the emperor turns water into theatre. The shoreline bursts into light. Lanterns sway from masts taller than buildings, illuminating decks paved not with planks, but with marble tiles. You blink, scarcely believing. The ships gleam like floating villas, with colonnades, gardens and gilded roofs reflecting the moon. They are so enormous that they seem anchored more in imagination than in the sea, but they are real, and they creak under the weight of orchards planted on deck, fountains spraying into the night air, and banqueting halls set upon waters that ripple gently below. A mainstream fact steadies your amazement. Caligula indeed commissioned colossal pleasure barges on Lake Nemi and at Baiae. Archaeological remains discovered centuries later confirmed their reality. Ships over 70 metres long, complete with marble floors, mosaics, plumbing, and luxury decorations. These were not tools of war or trade, but floating palaces, extravagant beyond necessity. You step onto one now. The deck is wide enough for gardens with pathways lined in mosaic tiles. Vines climb trellises, roses bloom under starlight, and statues of gods stand as though guarding the sea. Servants rush about carrying trays of wine, while musicians play flutes that echo faintly over the water. Beneath your feet the ship shifts, but gently, so massive it seems more stable than land. Quirky stories surround these ships. Some say Caligula staged naval battles on them, commanding nobles to act as rowers or gladiators, humiliating them in sight of the sea. Others whisper that he demanded banquets while the ships drifted in circles, with guests forced to toast him while struggling to keep balance on the rolling deck. Whether fact or exaggeration, the imagery captures the essence. The sea itself bent into performance, nobles trapped on a stage from which there is no exit. Historians still argue whether these ships served purely as pleasure craft or had ritual significance. Some suggest they were floating temples, dedicated to Diana or Isis, where Caligula enacted religious ceremonies. Others believe they were indulgent experiments in luxury, proof that Roman engineering could turn even the sea into marble corridors. The debate continues, but the awe remains. You wander deeper into the vessel. A banqueting hall glimmers under torchlight, its ceiling painted with constellations, its floor a glittering mosaic of waves. Guests recline on couches as servants pour Falernian wine into golden cups, but the mood is tense. You see senators gripping the edges of their couches, women forcing smiles, musicians trembling as they pluck strings. For the emperor is not content with food and wine alone. He demands spectacle. Imagine him rising suddenly, his robe shimmering, announcing a new ritual. Perhaps he declares himself Neptune reborn, striding barefoot across the deck, trident in hand. Priests scramble to adapt, chanting praises not to the sea god but to the emperor. The guests kneel, the waves slap against the hull, and you realise the absurd power of the moment. A mortal man demanding the ocean itself bear witness to his divinity. A mainstream fact adds to the scene. Caligula was fascinated by the sea. Ancient authors recount his bizarre order for legions to collect seashells as spoils of the sea during a campaign, mocking their seriousness. On ships like these, that fascination transforms into obsession. The sea is no longer barrier or battlefield, it is stage, conquered by wood, marble, and imagination. Quirky details sparkle from gossip. One story claims he held orgiastic feasts on these barges, filling them with dancers, musicians, and exotic animals. Imagine lions tethered in golden chains prowling decks while guests sip wine, or peacocks strutting among tables as musicians play. Another tale suggests he demanded storms be celebrated, forcing guests to stay on deck while lightning flashed, laughing at their terror as waves rock the ship. Whether literal or embroidered, the stories reflect the same truth. For Caligula, discomfort and awe were interchangeable tools of performance. Historians still argue whether these rumours represent reality or hostile invention, but archaeology proves at least part of the spectacle was real. The scale of the ships, their luxury, their sheer impracticality. Whatever occurred on them, they embodied excess so vast it became theatre in itself. You wander into a smaller chamber, richly decorated with ivory inlays and polished marble. Mirrors line the walls, multiplying torchlight until the room seems aflame. Here, perhaps, the emperor hosted private games. A noblewoman is summoned to recite poetry, a senator forced to juggle fruit, a general commanded to sing. Their dignity dissolves as laughter rings out. The emperor reclines, sipping wine, his smile sharp as a blade. You sense the same pattern as on land, humiliation staged as entertainment, with the sea trapping the actors on a floating stage. A mainstream fact underlines the oddity. Roman emperors often sought to impress with naval spectacles. Augustus staged mock sea battles in artificial basins. Claudius drained a lake for one. Caligula's ships, though, were unique. More pleasure palace than battle stage, indulgent beyond precedent. Quirky tales return like waves. Some say he built a floating bridge of ships across the Bay of Baiae, riding his horse across it in defiance of a prophecy that no one could ride across the bay. Citizens lined the shore, watching as their emperor galloped across the sea, laughing at fate itself. Imagine the thunder of hooves on planks, the sea surging beneath, the crowd torn between awe and disbelief. Whether political theatre or childish dare, It etched itself into memory as proof of his will to bend nature itself. Historians still argue whether this stunt was arrogance, satire, or a calculated display of power. Did he mock the Senate's obsession with omens? Did he thrill the people with defiance of the impossible? Or was it simple vanity? The truth may never be clear, but the image remains. A man riding across the sea as though it were marble pavement. The night deepens as you stand on deck, the stars reflected in the calm water. Music drifts across the bay, mingled with nervous laughter and the splash of waves. You realise how surreal it must have felt to be trapped on such ships. Luxury pressing down like chains, the sea offering no escape, the Emperor always watching. These voyages were not relaxation but rehearsals in obedience, staged against the infinite backdrop of ocean and sky. You step back toward the shore, your sandals slipping slightly on the damp planks. Behind you, the ships loom like floating dreams, glittering and grotesque. Ahead lies the city, restless and whispering. The sea has been conquered for now, but gossip spreads faster than waves. Citizens in taverns, senators in baths, women in markets, all repeat the stories, layering truth and rumour until no one can tell them apart. And so the stage shifts again. The Emperor's theatre moves from sea to city, from spectacle to story. Soon you will find yourself among whispers in the forum, where rumour becomes its own performance, a new kind of ritual in Caligula's Rome. The ships of Baiae fade into the mist behind you, their torches dwindling until they look like stars sinking into the sea. You walk inland again, and the hum of Rome rises in your ears, the rattle of carts, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of sandals on stone. But louder still is something less tangible, the rustle of voices. Everywhere you turn, people are whispering. In taverns, in bathhouses, in the shadow of temples, rumours cling to the air like incense smoke. They are as constant as the Tiber's current, shaping the city's imagination more forcefully than decrees or monuments. And in the centre of them all sits Caligula, a man who has made gossip into a second empire. You pause in the Forum Romanum, the marble heart of the city. Statues of heroes look down with stony calm, but the people below shift nervously, leaning close to trade stories. A baker mutters about the emperor seizing another man's wife at a feast. A senator's slave repeats a tale of senators forced to dance on stage. Children giggle, daring each other to imitate the emperor's shrill voice. In Rome, rumour is currency, and under Caligula it is minted fresh every day. A mainstream fact anchors the scene. Much of what we know about Caligula comes from ancient historians such as Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Josephus. Yet all admit that their accounts are coloured by rumour, satire, and hindsight. Even in antiquity, Romans struggled to separate fact from fabrication. You feel the same struggle now, standing among citizens whose eyes flick nervously toward the palace as they repeat stories they half believe. Quirky tales buzz like flies. One insists that Caligula once declared war on Neptune, marching troops to the seashore and ordering them to stab the waves with spears. Another claims he made his horse consul. People retell these stories with smirks and shrugs, never sure whether they are true but savouring the absurdity. Imagine being in a tavern late at night, wine flowing, someone leaning close to whisper, "Did you hear what the emperor did today?" Truth hardly matters. The story is enough to spark laughter, fear, or both. Historians still argue how many of these rumours reflect reality. Was the war on Neptune a deliberate satire of Rome's military rituals, mocking the Senate's obsession with conquest? Or was it pure invention, a joke inflated into legend? Even the contemporaries could not agree. And so rumour becomes its own kind of theatre, an improvisation performed by the entire city. You drift into a bathhouse, where steam curls around the columns. Men soak in warm pools, their voices hushed but eager. They share the latest tales, how Caligula dresses as a goddess one day and a gladiator the next, how he laughs during sacrifices, how he whispers to statues. Each story grows in the telling, like waves swelling into storms. You realise that in Rome, gossip is not idle chatter, it is survival. To know the latest rumour is to prepare yourself for tomorrow's humiliation. A mainstream fact steadies you again. Political rumour was a defining feature of Roman life. In a society without newspapers or broadcasts, word of mouth carried both truth and propaganda. Under Caligula, whose behaviour was unpredictable, rumour filled the gaps between fact and fear. Quirky anecdotes show how rumours spiralled. Some say children were taught to sing mocking songs about the emperor in secret, their parents listening in terror lest the wrong ears overhear. Others claim graffiti appeared on walls, scribbled lines mocking his divine pretensions. Imagine walking through a narrow alley and spotting crude drawings of the emperor with donkey ears, the ink still wet. You laugh nervously, then hurry away before a guard sees you. Historians still argue whether the emperor encouraged rumours by his very unpredictability. Some suggest he revelled in the confusion, deliberately feeding outlandish tales to keep Rome off balance. Others believe his excesses simply bred gossip naturally. Either way, the effect is the same. Rome becomes a chorus of whispers, each voice rehearsing its part in a never-ending play. You pause in the forum as a procession passes. Priests chant, incense wafts, but the crowd pays more attention to the murmurs behind them. "Did you hear?" one woman asks another. "He made the senators row his ships like slaves." The other gasps, repeating the tale louder until it spreads like wildfire. Truth dissolves, performance begins. The emperor's actions, whether witnessed or invented, become myth in real time. A mainstream fact anchors the humour and dread. Satire and gossip were integral to Roman culture. Poets and pamphleteers thrived on exaggeration, mocking emperors in biting verses. Under Caligula, rumour and satire blurred until it was impossible to know which was which. Quirky stories accumulate like pebbles in your sandals. One rumour says Caligula planned to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria, abandoning Rome. Another insists he drank pearls dissolved in vinegar to prove his wealth. Still another claims he spoke with the moon, holding midnight conversations with its silver face. Imagine how citizens must have felt, each tale stranger than the last, leaving them unsure whether to laugh or weep. Historians still argue whether some of these rumours were seeded after his death, part of the Senate's attempt to justify his assassination. Yet even if retroactive, they capture a truth about his reign, that the people experienced it as a blur of scandal and astonishment, where reality felt like theatre, and theatre felt like reality. You drift into a tavern where the air is thick with smoke and the tang of cheap wine. Sailors, slaves, and merchants cluster around tables, their voices rising as they share tales of the emperor. One insists he saw Caligula in disguise at the docks, another swears he heard him declare himself greater than Jupiter. Laughter erupts, but it carries an edge, the kind that hides fear. You sip your wine, tasting bitterness, and realise gossip is the only way the powerless can respond. They cannot resist the emperor, but they can mock him in whispers, reshaping him into a fool behind his back. A mainstream fact underlines this defiance. Roman satire often flourished in times of tyranny, as citizens turned to humour to process fear. In mocking Caligula, they found a fragile relief, even as they risked punishment. Quirky tidbits remind you of the danger. Some say Caligula punished those who laughed at street songs, hunting down singers and flogging them. Others whisper he employed spies to record tavern chatter. Imagine laughing at a joke in a smoky room, only to see guards burst in demanding names. Rumour itself becomes a trap, a performance with consequences. Historians still argue whether Caligula truly spied so obsessively, or whether later writers projected paranoia backward. But you can feel the tension. Gossip is both lifeline and threat, keeping Rome alive with stories while endangering every storyteller. The forum grows darker as night falls. Torches flicker, voices hush, and the marble statues loom larger. You stand in the centre, feeling the weight of rumour pressing in from every side. You realise the city itself is a stage, its people actors repeating lines they barely believe, their lives shaped not only by what the emperor does, but by what he is said to do. As you turn to leave, a final whisper catches your ear. They say the emperor will not live long. The gods themselves grow weary of his play. You shiver, not knowing whether it is prophecy, satire, or simple wishful thinking. In Rome, rumour is truth enough, and truth is rumour in disguise. The streets stretch ahead of you, carrying you toward quieter spaces where scholars and chroniclers wrestle with the same uncertainty. They too wonder how much of what you have heard is real, how much is invention. The curtain shifts again, and you find yourself stepping into the minds of those who will later write the story, piecing rumour into history. The whispers of the forum follow you like the hiss of cicadas, but as you walk away from the crowds and into quieter quarters, you enter another kind of space, less physical than intellectual. Here, the torches burn dimmer, the streets fall silent, and you hear the scratch of styluses on wax tablets, the murmur of readers in libraries, the restless sigh of men who try to transform rumour into record. You've entered the realm of scholars, historians and chroniclers, the ones who wrestled with Caligula not in person but in memory, trying to decide what was truth and what was theatre. You pause in a shadowed portico where a group of scribes sit at a long wooden table. They lean over scrolls, their eyes narrowing as they copy lines from older texts. You see their hesitation in the pause of their hands, in the furrow of their brows. Because writing about Caligula is not simple. Each detail is suspect, each anecdote a blend of scandal and satire. To record his reign is to step into the same play that consumed his life, uncertain whether you are writing history or rumour dressed in togas. A mainstream fact steadies you. Our principal sources on Caligula, Suetonius, Cassius Dio and Josephus, wrote years or even decades after his death. Their accounts are shaped by hindsight, by political agendas, and by the difficulty of separating memory from gossip. Suetonius delights in scandal, Dio in moral lessons, Josephus in Jewish perspective. None of them watched every act firsthand. You feel the frustration of distance even as you read their words. Quirky tidbits emerge from their contradictions. One source insists Caligula was assassinated because he humiliated senators too often. Another blames his extravagance. Another highlights paranoia about divine pretensions. Which is true? Which matters more? You imagine a Roman scholar sitting at his desk surrounded by conflicting testimonies, scratching his head and muttering, "How do I write sense about a man who lived nonsense?" Historians still argue whether Caligula's reign was truly as monstrous as remembered, or whether he became a convenient scapegoat, his flaws magnified into grotesque caricature. Was he a madman, a tyrant, or simply a victim of hostile propaganda? The debate continues, echoing through centuries like the murmur of distant voices in these scholarly halls. You step into a library, its shelves heavy with scrolls. The air smells of papyrus and dust. Students whisper in corners, repeating the most lurid tales. Caligula marrying his sister, Caligula fighting Neptune, Caligula dining on pearls dissolved in vinegar. Their eyes widen with fascination, but you notice the teachers shaking their heads, warning, "We must weigh sources carefully." Yet even as they caution, they copy the tales, unwilling to lose them. Gossip may not be truth, but it is irresistible. A mainstream fact anchors again. Roman historians often used anecdote not as literal fact, but as moral teaching. Exaggerated stories served to illustrate character, even if they bent reality. Caligula became not just a man, but a symbol of how absolute power corrupts absolutely. His legend was useful, even if untrustworthy. Quirky details reveal the tension. Suetonius describes Caligula's cruelty in vivid episodes, such as forcing parents to watch their children's executions. Dio paints him as unhinged, declaring himself a god with manic glee. Josephus, more cautious, portrays him as arrogant, but focuses on his failed attempt to place his statue in the temple at Jerusalem. 3 portraits, 3 lenses, none quite agreeing. Imagine trying to paint a face when each witness describes a different nose, a different smile, a different shadow. Historians still argue over method. Should we strip away the scandal and look for sober facts, or should we read the scandal itself as truth of perception, evidence of how Romans felt, even if not what literally happened? Some modern scholars suggest Caligula was not unusually cruel for his time, merely unlucky to be remembered through hostile pens. Others insist his reign truly spiraled into unprecedented chaos. The uncertainty lingers like smoke after a fire. You wander deeper into the library and find a group of philosophers debating in low tones. One insists Caligula's madness proves the danger of monarchy. Another counters that the Senate exaggerated his vices to justify their role in his assassination. A third shrugs and says, perhaps both are true. You realise this is the heart of the scholar's dilemma. Caligula resists neat categories. He is at once tyrant and actor, victim and villain, man and myth. A mainstream fact steadies again. Roman memory was shaped by damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. After his assassination, Caligula's statues were smashed, his name erased from inscriptions, his image removed from public places. yet the attempt to erase him paradoxically magnified him. The gaps were filled with rumour, the silence with scandal. In trying to destroy his memory, Rome ensured it survived more vividly. Quirky anecdotes show how his legacy lingered. In later centuries, playwrights and poets used him as shorthand for decadence. Medieval chroniclers invoked his name when condemning sinful kings. Even today he appears in novels, films and jokes, often stripped of historical nuance but rich in scandal. Imagine Suetonius smirking in his grave, realising his gossip has outlived marble temples. Historians still argue whether this endurance is fair. Was Caligula truly more corrupt than other emperors who killed rivals, seized wives, and claimed divinity? Or was he simply unlucky to have his reign cut short, leaving rumour to write the final act? The dilemma deepens the more you ponder it. You step outside into the night air again, your head buzzing with contradictions. The forum is quieter now, the whispers subdued, but the uncertainty lingers. You realise that for scholars, Caligula is not just a puzzle of facts, but a mirror of their own age. Each generation interprets him differently. Madman, tyrant, satirist, victim of propaganda, revealing more about themselves than about him. And you, walking through these marble streets, sense the trap. You too are caught in the theatre. Every rumour you've heard, every anecdote you've imagined, has become part of your memory of him. You cannot disentangle fact from performance any more than the citizens of Rome could. The scholar's dilemma is your dilemma too. A mainstream fact closes the circle. Caligula ruled for less than 4 years, from AD 37 to 41. Yet the pages devoted to him far exceed those given to emperors who reigned decades. His legend outweighs his chronology. Quirky tidbits remind you why. A man who made seashells into spoils, who rode horses across water, who named sisters goddesses, who humiliated senators and laughed during sacrifices. Whether true or not, these stories cling like burrs to the fabric of history. Historians still argue, and perhaps always will. And as you walk onward, you realise this is why the story never ends. Caligula is not only a figure of the past, but a performance replayed in every retelling. A theatre that historians and listeners alike cannot resist stepping into. The streets ahead grow darker. The whispers fade, replaced by a heavier silence. For beyond the scholar's dilemma lies the emperor's final act, when fear and paranoia overtake even spectacle, and the palace grows thick with plots. You feel the curtain drawing closer to its end. You leave behind the libraries and scholars, their scrolls littered with contradictions, and step back into the city's living heart. Rome itself feels restless, a place where rumour, humiliation, and spectacle have bled together until the boundary between performance and reality has vanished. Yet beneath the laughter, beneath the applause forced from trembling hands, you sense a heavier mood creeping in. A shift from flamboyant theatre to something darker. Caligula's Rome is now soaked in paranoia. The Palatine Hill looms above you, its torches flickering like restless eyes. Guards stand rigid at the gates, their armour gleaming under moonlight. You notice how their gaze lingers not only on passers-by but on each other. Even the protectors seem uncertain whom they serve. Rome, the gods, or the emperor's shifting whims. You climb the steps and feel the tension thickening in the air like storm clouds gathering over marble. A mainstream fact steadies you. Ancient authors consistently report that in the latter part of his reign, Caligula grew increasingly suspicious and violent. He accused senators of treason, executed nobles on flimsy grounds, and even turned on members of his own family. His reign, once dazzling in its absurdity, hardened into a climate of fear. You step inside the palace and notice how different it feels from before. Where once the mirrors reflected endless laughter and theatrical costumes, now they reflect silence. Servants move like ghosts, their footsteps muffled, their faces blank. Courtiers avoid eye contact, their smiles too taut, their conversations clipped. It is as though the palace itself has become a trap, its halls echoing with paranoia. Quirky anecdotes capture the transformation. One tale claims Caligula would invite nobles to dine, shower them with gifts, and then execute them the next morning, simply to remind others how fragile favour could be. Another says he wandered the palace at night, muttering to himself, testing doors, suspecting conspiracies in every shadow. Whether literal or exaggerated, the impression is unmistakable. A ruler who once delighted in humiliating others now began to fear humiliation himself. Historians still argue whether his paranoia was rooted in illness, political reality, or both. Some point to an early fever that may have damaged his mind, others to the constant threats faced by any emperor in a city where daggers were cheap and resentment plentiful. Whatever the cause, the effect is clear. The theatre has turned from comedy to tragedy, and the actors no longer know their lines. You pass into the Senate chamber. Senators sit stiffly, their faces pale as wax. The emperor stands before them, accusing one after another of disloyalty. Evidence is irrelevant. Suspicion is enough. A raised eyebrow, a whispered word, a dream reported by a servant, all can be twisted into proof of treason. You feel the senators' fear. They must clap, bow, and praise with perfect timing, yet none of it guarantees survival. Their dignity, already eroded by humiliations, is now joined by terror. A mainstream fact anchors the scene. Caligula ordered executions of senators, equestrians, and even close allies. His reign became marked by sudden purges, creating a climate where no one felt safe. Ancient accounts emphasize his unpredictability, one day generous, the next lethal. Quirky tidbits add to the horror. One account claims he had people executed slowly, delighting in watching their agony. Another insists he enjoyed announcing deaths as jokes, calling friends to a feast only to inform them their relatives had been killed that morning. These tales, even if exaggerated, reflect the perception of cruelty sharpened by paranoia. Historians still argue how much is invention. Did Caligula truly indulge in sadism, or did hostile senators after his death exaggerate his violence? Even cautious scholars admit, however, that the number of executions rose sharply in his final years, and the climate of fear was real. You step into a smaller chamber, dimly lit, where the emperor reclines alone. His face is pale, his eyes darting toward shadows. He speaks aloud, though no one listens, muttering about plots and omens. You notice charms scattered across the floor, sacrifices made hastily, as though the gods themselves must be bribed to keep daggers at bay. The emperor who once mocked Jupiter now begs the heavens for protection. Power, it seems, has curdled into dread. A mainstream fact steadies you. Caligula indeed became obsessed with omens and portents in his final years, consulting astrologers and seers. His earlier arrogance gave way to superstition, another symptom of his growing paranoia. Quirky stories cling like cobwebs. Some say he ordered lightning rods placed across the palace, terrified of storms. Others whisper he feared the full moon, retreating indoors when it shone. Whether literal or symbolic, these tales capture the essence. A man once striding across the sea on floating bridges now trembles at the sky. Historians still argue whether these fears were genuine or exaggerated by enemies to depict him as cowardly. Yet the pattern is clear. Paranoia narrowed his world, turning every sound into suspicion, every shadow into a threat. You drift back into the city streets, where paranoia seeps outward. Citizens lower their voices in taverns, careful not to repeat rumours too loudly. Merchants glance nervously at strangers, wondering if spies listen. Families whisper at night, warning children never to sing mocking songs. Rome itself feels like a stage where every actor suspects the others. A mainstream fact underscores this suffocating atmosphere. Emperors often relied on networks of informants, but under Caligula the system became notorious. Rewards were given for accusations, punishments for hesitation. The result was a city where betrayal was currency, and silence the only safety. Quirky anecdotes echo this fear. Some say Caligula punished a man for dreaming of his death. Another tale insists he executed nobles for praising the memory of Tiberius, treating nostalgia as treason. Even thoughts, it seemed, were dangerous. Imagine going to bed, your dreams restless, and waking in terror that someone might report them. Historians still argue whether such extremes were true or satirical embellishments. Yet the emotional truth is plain. Citizens lived as though every gesture might be fatal. You walk along the Tiber, its waters black under the moon. The river whispers of exiles cast from Rome, their villas seized, their names erased. You feel the loneliness of a city that once thrived on open speech but now shudders in silence. The forum's gossip, once playful, has thinned to whispers of survival. Inside the palace, Caligula paces. He trusts no one, not senators, not generals, not even his guards. His sisters have been exiled, his allies executed. He clings only to a shrinking circle of favourites, men chosen less for loyalty than for usefulness. Even they eye him warily, for they know what happens to favourites once the emperor grows bored. Historians still argue whether this spiral was inevitable. Absolute power breeds isolation. Paranoia is almost natural for emperors. But in Caligula's case, the speed of the descent shocks even seasoned scholars. 4 years, barely a breath in Rome's long history, yet enough to fill libraries with scandal. You pause at the palace gates as dawn begins to break. The light glints on bronze, and you hear the shuffle of guards changing watch. Their faces are blank, but their eyes betray weariness. They too are caught in the paranoia, for who will guard the emperor if the emperor trusts no guard? Who will wield the sword when the hand that commands it trembles with suspicion? And so the stage sets itself for the inevitable. A ruler who turned Rome into theatre now finds himself cornered, the actors restless, the audience weary. The performance cannot go on forever. The curtain must fall. You feel the tension rising with the morning sun. Somewhere in the palace, conspirators whisper. Somewhere in the forum, citizens wonder. Somewhere in Caligula's mind, fear grows sharper. The theatre of paranoia has reached its final act, and you are standing at its edge. The dawn you sensed on the Palatine Hill spreads slowly across Rome, gilding temples and rooftops in pale fire. Yet the warmth of morning does not ease the chill that lingers in the city. It is a chill of whispers, of sidelong glances, of plans hatched in secrecy. The emperor's paranoia has infected his court, and now, in return, the court begins to weave a paranoia of its own. You're stepping into the shadows of conspiracy, where daggers gleam faintly in imagination long before they shine in torchlight. The palace is quieter these days, though not from peace. Silence here is the hush of actors who know the play is reaching its climax. Servants speak in whispers, guards linger too long at their posts. Senators look at one another with eyes that ask unspoken questions. When will it end? You can feel the tension clinging to the marble, vibrating in the bronze doors, echoing under the vaults like the low rumble of an approaching storm. A mainstream fact steadies you. Caligula's assassination in AD 41 was the first successful removal of a reigning Roman emperor. He was killed by members of his own guard, the Praetorians, with senatorial backing. This fact alone shows the depth of dissatisfaction. For Rome's protectors to turn their blades inward was no small thing. Quirky stories abound in the run-up. One claims that senators began rehearsing how they would stab him, joking nervously over wine as though practicing lines for a play. Another whispers that astrologers muttered dark predictions, hinting the emperor's star was dimming. Whether true or embroidered, these tales capture the mood. Expectation of an ending, hunger for release. Historians still argue whether the conspiracy was carefully planned or hastily executed. Some sources suggest it was long in the making, driven by years of humiliation. Others insist the final spark was sudden, born of an insult too sharp, a fear too immediate. The truth lies somewhere between. Resentment waiting for its cue, paranoia sharpening into action. You wander into a dim corridor where guards mutter quietly. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, has grown restless. Once flattered with gifts, they now find themselves distrusted, sometimes executed on suspicion. Loyalty sours quickly when mixed with fear. Imagine being a soldier, your sword polished, your oath sworn, yet knowing the man you protect might have you strangled tomorrow for a dream he claims you dreamed. The tension becomes unbearable. A mainstream fact steadies again. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorians, became the chief conspirator. Caligula had mocked him repeatedly for a weak voice and effeminate manner, calling him names in public. Humiliation turned loyalty into hatred. Quirky anecdotes sharpen the edge. Some say Caligula enjoyed mocking Chaerea by giving him obscene watchwords to repeat at guard duty, forcing him to shout words that degraded his masculinity. The ridicule, repeated day after day, carved resentment deep enough to become lethal. Imagine standing before your men, forced to utter phrases designed to belittle you, while the emperor smirks. Eventually the insult grows heavier than the oath. Historians still argue how personal the motive truly was. Did Chaerea act out of wounded pride alone, or was he a willing instrument of senators desperate to end the reign? Some suggest he was chosen precisely because of his grievance, the perfect tool for collective resentment. Whatever the case, His dagger would soon speak louder than any insult. You step into a shadowed atrium where senators gather secretly. Their faces are grim, their whispers sharp. They talk not of laws or taxes, but of survival. Each has endured humiliation, forced to dance, stripped of estates, mocked before crowds. Each knows that if Caligula's paranoia deepens, their names may be next on the execution lists. They speak of duty, of Rome's dignity, but beneath the rhetoric lies fear. You feel it in the way their hands tremble, in the way their voices lower when a servant passes. A mainstream fact anchors the moment. Senators had little real power under Caligula, but they still represented Rome's ancient traditions. By mocking and humiliating them publicly, the emperor undermined their very identity. Their support of the conspiracy was as much self-preservation as patriotism. Quirky rumours cling to these meetings. Some claim they cast lots to decide who would strike the first blow, as though assigning roles in a play. Others whisper that they drank toasts to the gods of liberation, their lips trembling as they touched the cups. Whether literal or symbolic, these stories capture the strange mix of dread and resolve in the air. Historians still argue whether the Senate truly orchestrated the plot, or merely tolerated it. Some accounts credit the praetorians as the real movers, with senators opportunistically claiming credit afterward. Others emphasize senatorial resentment. The ambiguity itself reflects the fear. No one wanted to leave fingerprints, yet everyone wanted the outcome. You wander into the streets, where citizens gossip more cautiously now. Rumours swirl that the emperor's extravagance is draining the treasury, that taxes are rising, that the people's patience is thinning. But these voices are hushed, for even in discontent the emperor's spies listen. The public may not conspire openly, but their weariness fuels the resolve of others. A mainstream fact sharpens this point. Caligula's spending on games, ships and palaces strained Rome's finances. While not catastrophic, it was enough to breed discontent among soldiers and citizens alike. When spectacle loses its charm, it begins to feel like theft. Quirky anecdotes sprinkle salt. Some claim the emperor considered moving the capital to Alexandria, abandoning Rome itself. True or not, the rumour cut deep, for to Romans the city was not negotiable. Imagine citizens hearing that their emperor might abandon them for another land. Fear and resentment would spread like wildfire. Historians still argue whether Caligula truly planned such a move, or whether it was rumour weaponized by enemies. Yet the effect was real. Citizens began to see him as alien, less Roman than divine caricature, less emperor than tyrant. You return to the palace, sensing how the threads draw tighter. Chaerea sharpens his blade. Senators whisper rehearsals of courage. Guards look at one another with silent questions. Even family members, once pawns in his theatre, now watch carefully, their survival uncertain. The palace that once rang with laughter and spectacle now hums with expectation, like an orchestra tuning before the final act. Inside his chambers, Caligula paces. He is restless, perhaps sensing something he cannot name. He has turned even joy into parody, and now joy no longer sustains him. He suspects everyone and trusts no one, yet believes himself immortal. He still laughs at omens, still plays with rituals, still humiliates nobles, but the laughter is sharper, more brittle. You sense that he is both master and prisoner of his own theatre, unable to step out even as the curtain threatens to fall. Historians still argue whether Caligula had any inkling of the plot. Some suggest he was too blinded by arrogance, convinced of his divinity. Others think he suspected but underestimated the resolve of his enemies. Either way, his paranoia did not save him. You pause at the threshold of the palace courtyard, where the conspirators will soon gather. You feel the tension in the stones, as though they know they are about to be stained. This is no longer rumour or theatre. It is the stage of blood. The night deepens, and you realise the play is nearing its end. The next act will not be feasts or games, but daggers flashing under torchlight. The emperor who turned Rome into performance will himself become the centrepiece of a performance he cannot control. The conspiracy has grown too strong, too certain. The curtain is trembling, ready to drop. The palace is hushed, but it is not silence. It is anticipation. You walk once more across the Palatine, and though dawn has broken, the marble feels colder than before. Guards stand stiffly, their eyes shifting too quickly. Senators file in for ceremonies, their togas bright against the shadowed halls. Even the servants scurry with unusual haste, as though they sense the moment has come. The play that has consumed Rome is reaching its last act. The day begins with spectacle, as always. Caligula, restless for entertainment, orders games in his honour. The amphitheatre fills with citizens eager to watch, though eagerness is tempered with fear. They have cheered too many times before, uncertain whether their applause is loyalty or trap. The emperor strides to his seat, gleaming in robes of gold, the crowd's cheers swelling like a wave. He soaks it in, stretching his arms wide as though Jupiter himself has descended. You feel the familiar rhythm of performance, his voice sharp, his laughter shrill, the audience caught between awe and dread. A mainstream fact steadies you. The assassination occurred on January 24th, AD 41, during the Palatine Games. Ancient sources agree that Caligula was attacked while leaving the theatre, ambushed by conspirators led by Cassius Chaerea. The timing was deliberate, the emperor distracted, the crowd noisy, the conspirators hidden in plain sight. Quirky tales attach themselves to this final morning. Some say Caligula stopped the games midway to berate the audience, mocking their cheers as insincere. Others claim he laughed at omens, sneering at prophecies of doom. Whether true or embroidered, the image is haunting. A man laughing at fate while fate sharpens its knives. Historians still argue whether he sensed the danger. Some suggest he dismissed warnings, convinced of his divinity. Others believe he was oblivious, blinded by arrogance. You can almost hear the debate echoing in the stands. Was this confidence or delusion? The games conclude, the emperor rises, and the crowd parts as he moves toward the palace. Senators follow, guards flank him, musicians trail behind. The air is heavy, each step weighted with inevitability. You walk with them, your heartbeat quickening. The narrow corridors ahead are lined with shadows, the perfect stage for an ambush. Inside, the emperor pauses to speak with actors, his voice high and mocking. He laughs, makes a crude joke, waves his hand dismissively at Chaerea, again insulting his voice. The insult hangs in the air, sharp as a drawn blade. You sense the tribune's fury, simmering beneath composure. Then Caligula turns his back. It is the cue. A mainstream fact anchors the moment. Chaerea struck the first blow. Accounts vary. Some say he stabbed the emperor in the neck, others in the shoulder. What matters is that it broke the silence, that the stage of humiliation became stage of vengeance. Quirky details sharpen the image. Some sources claim Caligula cried out, "I am still alive!" after the first wound, staggering, trying to flee. Others say he fell silently, his golden robe pooling around him like spilled sunlight. Senators and guards rushed in, their daggers flashing, stabbing again and again until divinity was reduced to mortal flesh. Imagine the sound. Not the roar of crowds, not the laughter of feasts, but the wet thud of steel in flesh, the hiss of breath, the scuffle of sandals on marble. Historians still argue how many struck. Some say 30 wounds, others more. The frenzy itself matters more than the number. Men who had cowered for years seized their chance. Each blade a rehearsal turned real, each stab a release of humiliation. You watch them, their faces twisted, their hands slick, their eyes wide, not with triumph, but with disbelief that the emperor can bleed. The emperor's guards stand stunned at first. Some join the fray, others scatter. The man who was untouchable moments ago is reduced to silence on the marble floor. His eyes, once darting with suspicion, now stare blankly. His body, once draped in gold, lies crumpled, robbed of grandeur. The theatre ends not with applause but with gasps, the audience struck mute by the suddenness of the fall. A mainstream fact steadies again. Caligula was 28 years old at his death, having ruled less than 4 years. His reign, though short, left scars deep enough to echo through centuries. Quirky anecdotes spill over in the aftermath. Some say his body was dragged through corridors, abandoned until his sister's allies retrieved it. Others claim soldiers, still loyal, buried him hastily in shallow ground. His corpse, once treated as divine, was hidden like a criminal's. The contrast could not be sharper, from god to corpse, from emperor to carcass in the span of minutes. Historians still argue about the motives of his assassins. Were they liberators restoring Rome's dignity, or cowards lashing out after years of humiliation? Some portray Chaerea as hero, others as bitter pawn. The ambiguity lingers, just as it did with every story of his reign. The palace erupts in chaos. Citizens scatter, uncertain whether to celebrate or grieve. Senators rush to convene, their voices rising in panic. The Praetorians, divided, debate whether to restore the Senate's power or crown a new emperor. Rumour swirls faster than fact. Is Caligula dead? Was it an accident? Will the gods punish Rome for killing a man who claimed divinity? The uncertainty is thicker than smoke. You drift into the streets, where citizens whisper anxiously. Some cheer, others mourn, many simply wait. They have lived in theatre too long to know whether the play has truly ended. Perhaps it is another performance, another humiliation, another trick. They hesitate to believe the curtain has fallen until the torches dim. A mainstream fact steadies. The assassins also targeted Caligula's wife, Caesonia, and his young daughter. Accounts differ. Some say they were killed immediately, others later. The violence spread, a purge to extinguish his line. Rome did not simply kill an emperor, it attempted to erase his future. Quirky details cling to the chaos. Some say his body was hacked beyond recognition. Others whisper that the conspirators debated leaving it unburied as warning. Yet eventually, loyal women of his family interred him quietly in the gardens of Lamia. Even in death, secrecy and rumour cloaked him. Historians still argue about the meaning of his assassination. Was it the triumph of Senate over tyranny, the first crack in the imperial system, or simply another act in Rome's endless cycle of power and betrayal? The debate endures, because the ending, like the rain, resists clarity. You stand in the forum as night falls again. The torches flicker, the crowd murmurs, and you realise that Rome itself is holding its breath. The emperor is dead, but the theatre he created lingers. His laughter echoes in rumour, his humiliation in memory, his extravagance in legend. No dagger can kill a story once it has taken root, and so the curtain falls, not with applause, not with closure, but with the restless silence of an audience unsure what they have just witnessed. Was it tragedy? Comedy? Farce? The only certainty is that Rome will never forget. Now the lights dim, the marble cools, the whispers soften. It is time for you too to step away from the stage. The play of Caligula's reign is over, and so, listener, let your breath grow slower as the curtain draws to its end. The echoes of daggers and laughter fade into the distance, leaving only the gentle rhythm of your own heartbeat. Rome lies quiet now, its streets washed in moonlight, its voices hushed. The marble columns stand tall, indifferent to rumour, blood, or spectacle. The emperor's stage has vanished, leaving only stillness. You rest here, knowing that history is always a kind of theatre, sometimes cruel, sometimes comic, always unfinished. Caligula's story, wild and tangled, has played its course, and the actors have left the stage. What lingers is not dread, but reflection. How power dazzles, how rumour shapes memory, how even emperors are mortal when the curtain falls. Let the air grow soft around you, like linen sheets drawn close. Let the torches fade into fireflies, the whispers dissolve into silence. You're no longer in marble halls, but in your own quiet space, where history's noise can drift away like smoke. Sleep comes gently now, carrying you past the sharp edges of scandal and into calmer waters. Imagine the sea lapping quietly at Nemi's shores, the stars steady above, the world at peace. No laughter, no rumour, no fear, only stillness.